10 years ago suddenly opened a huge gate that leads to another dimension, and no one could even imagine that from this gate huge monsters began to appear, and their number was so huge that the world army could not cope with them because ordinary weapons did not work on them. But at the same time there appeared hunters who had magic power, and their classes were distributed from the highest to the lowest, and that they were much stronger than ordinary people, and with the help of their magic and magic weapons, they could destroy one monster after another. 10 years later, in the city where the first gate appeared, a lot of hunters would go out to make money and kill monsters in the dungeon. And now we see two hunters who met after many years of dungeon adventures together, and as they talked about the old days, the other hunters began to slowly converge on the place where the gate had opened, and while some were approaching, others were able to set up for the battle and drink their last cup of coffee. But at that moment, a guy named Sun Jin Woo appeared. If you ignore his somewhat unusual strength and regeneration, it's a little embarrassing that he can call himself a hunter. And entering a construction site that was in Seoul, two hunters noticed Sun Jin Woo and started waving at him. But the other hunter couldn't understand if Sun Jin Woo was a strong hunter. Everyone was so happy that he had come. But Mr. Kim started to reply that this guy is the weakest in the world, and that he's so weak that he can get hurt in a ranked dungeon, and his coming means that their dungeon will be easy. And as soon as he took his cup of coffee, and then started walking up to the other hunters and greeting them. And as he passed the guys he had recently greeted, he heard them tell him that they called him the weakest weapon in the world. And before he could reply, he could hear everything. At that moment, he heard the familiar voice of the girl Ju Hee, who was also in this raid. The new girl started asking him how he managed to hurt his face this time, to which Sun Jin Woo began to reply that he didn't know because he always gets hurt when he hunts. But sitting down on the building materials, he began to explain that they were in the E-rank dungeon, and he was the only one injured because the others were ranked higher, so they didn't take healers. And after talking for a few more minutes, Sun Jin Woo heard that the other hunters were getting ready to enter the gate, and that they should join them too. And approaching one of the hunters, he began to say that it was time for him to try his best. He might not be the best fit for this role, but he would like to be the leader of their group for this raid. But the other hunters realized that he was the only strongest of them, so no one was against it. And gathered all the equipment, they started to go into the dungeon together, to destroy the boss and make more money. Sun Jin Woo, who was the last one to enter, was ready to give his best today, because today he would not get hurt, and he would survive, and he would earn more money to take care of his family just like the others. A little while later, he managed to get one magic stone. But suddenly, he was attacked from the corner by a monster because our hero had a bad weapon. He was injured and maimed. But this time, he was lucky to have a healer girl who used her magic to help him. And while she healed his wounds, the other hunters dealt with all the monsters that were in the dungeon. After that, they gathered in a place and started to thank each other for having each other's backs. But Sun Jin Woo wasn't as happy as the others, because he still took a lot of damage and made the girl stay by his side and heal him early. Well, at some point, one of the hunters shouted that he had found a secret passage to another cave, and they all started to go to the cave and explore it. And after a short time of thinking, they realized that there was a double dungeon hidden here, and now they had to decide what they were going to do next, because if they went out, other hunters would come in and take all the goodies for themselves. But the leader of the group started to suggest that they would now vote on whether to go into the double dungeon or go back out. And after a short time of voting, they were evenly divided. The last person who did not vote was Sun Jin Woo, and now he will decide what to do next because he needs to help his mom, who is in the hospital, and his sister, who wants to go to university. After a short time of thinking, he clenched his magic crystal that he held in his hands and decided that he agreed to go to the double dungeon. A little while later, our group of young monster hunters continued to walk through the deep cave, but they realized that they were on their way. If they could destroy the dungeon boss, they would still have 20 minutes to get out of the dungeon because it would automatically close. But at this point, the healer girl was a little angry with Sun Jin Woo because she kept treating his wounds and he kept walking and made himself a threat. But after a few minutes, they reached the end of the cave and saw a huge door in front of them. And without thinking, the squad leader started saying that they were going to go inside that door, so everybody should be on their guard. Well, as soon as the door opened, they went inside. They saw that the facels that lit the room started to light up on their own. 59. But the hunters had never seen a dungeon like this before, and inside it looked like no one had been here for a long time. And those statues, they looked strange, because each one was holding something different, and some of them even had musical instruments. Well, the most amazing thing was the huge statue that was in the center, and looking at it, Sun Jin Woo hoped it wasn't the dungeon boss. But after walking a little further, they came across a magical seal with the rules of the Carrion Temple written on it. The first was to worship the Lord, the second was to praise the Lord, and the third was to prove your loyalty to him. And while the other hunters were familiarizing themselves with the rules, the healer girl who was near our hero said that the eyes of the huge statue had just looked right at them. 68. But right after that, the door through which they had entered suddenly slammed shut, and some of the hunters couldn't understand what was going on here. One of them began to say that he had had enough and was leaving now because it was a mistake to come here. As soon as he came to the door, a huge statue that was on opposite sides of the door suddenly moved and started swinging its huge axe, and with one blow it destroyed the hunter. The other hunters couldn't believe what had just happened and that they had to fight these huge statues. Sun Jinwoo quickly turned his head and looked at the huge statue that was behind him, and in an instant the huge statue started to look straight into the eyes of our hero. It was not the first time for Sun Jinwoo to be in a deadly situation, and during his first raid he was left behind and lost, and even almost died of starvation when he was trapped in a dungeon. But the worst part is that he has to work twice as hard to take care of his family. But at the same time, he saw the eyes of a huge monster looking straight at him, and at the same moment the eyes began to glow with bright fire, and Sun Jinwoo shouted for everyone to fall to the ground, as bright rays began to appear from the eyes of the huge stat that destroyed everything in its path, and most of the hunters simply died on the spot. And raised his eyes. The hunters saw that they were miraculously alive, but still they could not understand how they could kill all the statues, because it would take a long time.
But sometimes sinister and very dangerous monsters can lurk behind gates. I turned your arm, but the bleeding never stopped. I don't know how else I can help you. I don't know what more can be done myself. I didn't think it would be this difficult. I only invited 3 healers and I thought we could do it faster. But it's so dangerous here that one of them was killed so brutally that there was nothing left of him. The second one was rendered speechless and went into shock from what he saw. The third healer, whom you know, can't get her act together. If she survives, this situation will haunt her for a long time. As you can see, it's going to be hard to heal with their skills in this situation. I don't think we can do anything with him. His look inspires great fear. Eventually they decided that when the situation subsided a little, they would try to escape, but it wouldn't be that easy. Desperate, the rest of the group didn't understand why they had come here. After all, this is only a D-rank dungeon. Our protagonist realized that if they went through that big statue, there was no way they could get past the guards guarding the door. "I'm not going to die here," shouted one of the hunters. "I just joined a normal guild, I'm strong, so I can get out." At that moment their leader cried out, "Don't do it!" But nothing could stop him anymore. He could only rely on his speed skills. He rushed like a bullet, running with all his speed, but in an instant the statue spotted him and shot out its laser eyes. All that was left of the runner was his legs. He never made it. Everyone was shocked by what was happening. Everyone who saw it was so dumbfounded that they couldn't look at what had happened. Everyone, as one, understood that they could be massacred at any moment. Jinwoo understood that they could kill them at any moment, but those creatures did not, and they did not understand why. That big statue doesn't kill for no reason, but those guards who guard the door sweep away anything that comes near them. From the attack, they have some kind of order, thought Jinwoo. Exactly an order, how I didn't think of it before. Does anyone know if this room has its own rules? When he saw the precepts of the Kartanon temple, he shrieked, "This is it." He turned to his friend Song for help. "What was the first commandment? Have you read them?" he asked. "The commandment seems to say, worship the Lord," answered Sangha. "Then that is the Lord, sir. This dungeon has its own rules." "What are you thinking?" shrieking, Sangha. "And if I'm right, he doesn't attack those who don't move." It was obvious from Jinwoo's actions that he was not looking for death, but rather wanted to save everyone. He made a decision and realized that the statue only attacks those who stand at a certain height. He finally understood the essence of the first commandment and cried out, "Hear him and bow to the Lord." Everyone thought he was crazy, but he knew it could save their lives. Jinwoo realized that if they worshipped him, it meant directly praising him. This premonition might have saved them. "We will live, we will finally get out of this dungeon by worshipping." That was all they thought about, but at that moment, goosebumps went up their bodies, and as soon as they looked up, they saw the terrifying smile on the statue's stone face. His expression changed. "What is it?" our hero shrieked. "How many times has he attacked us already? How many more times do we have to worship him? We were all wondering the same thing. It seems to have stopped. I don't think he's going to do anything worse. Will it be okay just because we worshipped him? 555, don't get up. If you get up, his attacks will continue. Look, nothing happens, and then they realize that, like, it's over. We survived, we can stay alive. But the protagonist didn't think so, he realized it wasn't over. There were loud noises, and it felt like an earthquake had started. They saw the statue begin to rise from its throne. The statue was so big that the hunters seemed like small cockroaches against it. Jinwoo, tell me, do you have any more ideas? Shrieked Sanggu, but at that moment our hero stared dumbfoundedly at the scale of the statue that was coming in their direction, and it seemed to be the end. But Jinwoo remembered that this dungeon has its own rules. 1. Swear an oath to the Lord. 2. Exalt the Lord. That's supposed to be the solution, isn't it? Exalt exactly, cried one of the hunters. He was one of the members of the church choir and knew how to sing and pray. He pulled out his cross, which hung around his neck, and began to praise the Lord. They thought it worked. The statue even began to move more slowly. But Jinwoo realized too late that that hunter was praying to the wrong god. The statue straightened up in an instant, stepping on the hunter who was reciting the prayer. They began to run with all their feet and shout for help, until one of them cried out, "Run together, it's dangerous. We have to split up." Jinwoo took hold of the hand of the girl who was running behind him and realized that if he let her go, she would be finished. As Buck ran, he remembered what he was here for, and how his wife had begged him to find a safe job. But he wanted to earn more, and here he is standing under the stone statue, thinking he is safe here. He doesn't hear anyone shouting at him to turn around and see that there's a monster behind him that will cut him in half in an instant. "Exalt the Lord! Exalt the Lord!" shouted Jinwoo, running away from them. He did not know what to do. There were guards in the front, a huge statue in the back. They attacked them with anything, sword, axe, spear. They did not care who was in front of them. They had only one task. Kill them all. Jinwoo could not understand why the guards had musical instruments. Perhaps it told him that the guards start acting when they are approached. Thus, it might be the key to the exit. He seemed to understand again what to do next. They started running toward the statues with the tools, and then a miracle happened. They weren't attacking, they were playing young. They started looking for other statues. While Song sat beneath the statue and looked at the monster that stood before him, Jinwoo ran up to the statue, but nothing was happening. He couldn't figure out what was wrong. But then they realized that if the two of them stood under the same statue, it wouldn't play a tune. Jinwoo immediately ran on, but the huge statue spotted him. At this point he ran up to the statue with the instruments, but it turned out to be a guardian, and instead of instruments he had a shield. He mistook it for another and struck, and Jinwoo was wounded. He did not, however, give up the suspense of dying there and crawled on, hoping to find the statue with the musical instrument. He was always on the cusp of death, always grasping the thread that kept him from dying, but now it could break at any moment. As soon as Jinwoo heard the tune, he sighed. For a second he thought he was going to be killed, but at the last moment he was able to get to safety. He was wounded and exhausted. Julie came running as soon as it was safer, and from what she saw she couldn't hold back the tears. "Your legs!" she shouted at the top of her voice. She saw a lot of blood that was everywhere. Jinwoo was lying on the floor without one leg, but the healer begged him to hold on a little longer, and she could stop the blood and heal his leg. However, she did not expect that the fact that she spent a lot of mana would make her feel bad. She'll be fine, lucky that Jinwoo was able to survive such injuries. There were 17 of them, but in the end there were only 8 left, and 2 of them were severely injured. "Mr. Song, it's unfortunate that you are injured, but it's because you made a lot of rash decisions. After all, you are the reason this happened. Are you willing to be punished for that? That bastard is attacking again," the group of survivors thought. "Don't tell me he's attacking again." They felt everyone's legs buckle and thought it was an earthquake. But the monster lifted something off the ground. This was the altar on which the sacrifice was to take place, and the final commandment, "Prove your faith." "This was the final test, no matter how foolish I was," said one of the hunters. "I know where this will lead. Mr. Song, does this mean that someone has to sacrifice himself?" 5. Aiming his dagger at Mr. Song, one of the hunters began to say that everything was his fault. He said that his 10 men had died in vain because of him and that he should take all the blame. Mr. Kim was right, and no matter what happens next, I'm willing to take responsibility. The only one who was against it was Jin Woo. He started screaming that it was mean to say he was guilty, since you all decided to come here on your own. At this point, Mr. Song walked into the circle of the altar and saw a strange light that lit up red. One tribe told Jin Woo, what could it mean? He asked the guys to help him get to the altar. They thought they were safe now, but the gate had opened a week ago, and it was unlikely the hunters could save them now. But these things will move before reinforcements arrive. The guild is not likely to dare send someone to check here so quickly. It's only a D-rank dungeon. The gates will open after 7 days. That means if we don't close it, all the monsters can make it to the surface. If we can't do that, that big statue can get out. Most likely, the ordeal will begin when all the survivors are able to enter the circle. So it did, once everyone was assembled and all the lights came on. There was a sound of the hunters shouting, did the door finally open and we could get out, but now anything could happen. The statues that were standing still began to move. They slowly but surely watched the altar. They didn't know what to do, and there were so many of them and a little bit of them began to surround them. The group of hunters began to realize that if they didn't look at the guards, they would keep moving. The group of hunters began to realize that if they didn't look at the guards, they would keep moving. But what was that? She was able to run out of the cave, but the genie will realize that if one person leaves the altar the lights go out and the gate closes a bit. Those commandments were hard, but the last one was very clear. When they went into the circle, the lights went on and went out as long as the person left the altar. The hunter who stood and held the wounded Jinwoo could not endure and asked forgiveness, then rushed to the exit, from which Jinwoo fell to the floor because he was missing one leg. He shouted, stay where you are or we will die. There aren't enough of us all to look at every statue. Jinwoo understood that. He understood that all the blue lights had to burn out and then the ordeal would be over. But it could also mean the opposite, that the doors could close back. No one would think that the weakest hunter could be so useful. Everyone looked up to him. Many died when they entered the dungeons, but those who survived, thanks to you Jinwoo, thanks to you, and I am alive, but I can't stay here anymore. I have a family too. I can't die here. Mr. Kim shouted to Jinwoo. But all he heard was sorry. He ran off and threw the rest of Jinwoo to his death, dumbfounded by such an act he certainly didn't expect. The gate was about to close, and now they realized that everyone had to leave, but one person would stay and sacrifice himself. So it was decided that Jinwoo and Madame Chiyul would leave together and Mr. Song would stay. But as soon as Chiyul wanted to get up, her legs, they did not obey her. It was because of the depletion of mana. She used it a lot when she healed Jinwoo. Mr. Song, help her get up. I can't walk with my leg. You are the only one who can help her. Take care of her. As soon as they left, Jinwoo was left alone. He sat by the altar and thought only that thank God he is the only one, so something will die here at least. He sat alone and was ready for the outcome. Since it came to this, I will take one of you with me, he shouted. Go ahead and attack. I am not afraid of you anymore. The guards started to attack him blow by blow, and it was almost over. The only thing our hero thought about was that he changed his mind about dying for sure. He didn't want such an outcome. The last cry that was, if only I had been given one more chance. My eyes were closing, but out of nowhere an alert popped up that said you had completed all the necessary requirements of the secret Brave Man's mission. It was that last chance to become a player of the system and survive, but it needed the player's permission. If you refuse, your heart will stop in 2 seconds. Jinwoo was dumbfounded, but the fact that he wanted to live did not negate the fact that he would not agree. He made a decision. The bright light woke me up, and when I opened my eyes and woke up in the hospital, I could hardly breathe. I had just died. But what was it really? Maybe it was a dream, but I started to turn my head and saw that I was in the hospital. At that time, 2 guys in suits came up to me. Turns out they were waiting for me to wake up, but I didn't realize who they were. And when they got closer, they apologized for the disturbance. It turned out to be the Korean Hunters Association. I didn't understand what they wanted from me, but when I found out I had been asleep for 3 whole days, I couldn't believe it. After that, I started asking them questions about what happened to Mrs. Juhee and Mr. Song. I hoped they were safe. But these guys responded that they were fine, but that Mr. Song would now have trouble working because of one arm, and from then on, if he wanted to, he could retire. And Juhee, being a hunter, is still being treated for psychological trauma, and it is not clear to them now whether they will remain hunters. As soon as they started looking for other hunters like sick, I interrupted them and told them that was enough. I had heard everything I wanted to hear, and I didn't need any more. But the man went on to tell me that only 6 people had survived after visiting the double cave. Although hunters are always in danger when hunting, this kind of carnage doesn't happen very often. When the Hunters Association and the White Tiger Guild arrived on the scene, they had all disappeared, and there was only me lying on the altar in the cave. Neither the statues nor what the others described were found. We have been unable to find an explanation for what happened, but this is only a theory. However, these guys believe that I went through a rebirth. I certainly couldn't believe it, because a hunter's stats are set when he doesn't get the awakening or the power. Some hunters can get awakening again and rise in rank, but these guys brought with them a gauge of magical power, and all I had to do was put my hand on the crystal. If these were the high-level, deadly monsters the survivors had told me about, ordinary hunters would not be able to handle them. Only rank units or S ranks could make a difference, but when they put their hand on the crystal, all these monsters simply disappeared. Then they suspected that Hunter Song Jinwoo had been reawakened, since he was the only surviving hunter. But after I got my hand in, they thought I was trash, and because the lowest E rank is at least 70, and I turned out to have 10. After that, the man said they suspected me for no reason, and they left. When they walked out the door, I didn't realize that they hadn't noticed what was right above my bed hung a notification system that had a message. I turned my attention to my leg, and it was in place, even though it had been completely cut off. And there was nothing wrong with my pierced breast. I couldn't tell the difference between this dream and reality and wondered, should I have told them what I was seeing in front of me now? And it certainly wasn't a touchscreen. But at one point my sister came into my room and asked me what I was doing, because I was just standing on the bed poking my finger in the air. She asked me how I was feeling, and after that she immediately jumped on me, because she was telling me not to get hurt again, because she was very worried about me. She kept yelling, "What about the others? Is everything okay? So why am I the only one who got hurt?" But I was in my own thoughts and couldn't believe I almost left her. I didn't think I'd made it out of that dream. But that message spoke back to me. I asked my sister if she was seeing what I was seeing, but she didn't understand what I was starting to say. I told her that when there was an unread message in play, how could I read it? She didn't understand what I was talking about, but seeing my message, that I had become a player and had a daily task to become stronger. I didn't understand what it was all about. A little later my sister came out of my room and along with her girlfriend started to leave. I started reading my alerts. It said that the system would help the player grow. If he disobeyed the orders of the system, he could be punished. And I also had some rewards, but I couldn't figure out what they were telling me. Well, for a second I thought I saw something similar when I was lying on the altar. The first thing that interested me was that I saw a message about the daily Prepare to Get Stronger challenge. I decided to check it out and opened this message. Inside were the instructions for the quest, and its purpose was to work out push-ups, abs, and squats, as well as exercise and running. However, below was a warning that if I didn't complete the daily quest, I would be sent to the village instantly as punishment. But I thought it was some kind of joke, so I decided to continue lying down and resting, only to find out about everything after a good night's sleep. However, I suddenly woke up to the fact that my bed started jumping in different directions, as if an earthquake was about to start. In an instant, I found myself in some kind of desert. I couldn't believe my eyes, because I thought I was dreaming. But when I turned my head, I saw a giant poisonous centipede looking right at me and wanting to eat me. Immediately after that I got the quest instructions, and the penalty task stated that I needed to survive in 4 hours. But for me, that was something horrible. I was running away on all my feet, for I was trying to survive in strict accordance with the mission, but the monsters were chasing me the whole time. They jumped out of all the barcons and sands that were near me. But once 4 hours passed and I got my alert, I managed to survive. I finally finished my adventure and at one point found myself in my hospital room. I jumped out of bed like the ground was sandy and fell to the floor, just as I did. I was terribly exhausted, for I had been running for 4 hours from the horrible monsters that were chasing me. When I was finally able to raise my head, I saw a notification that said that my reward for completing the punishing task had been received and I could take it. However, I was so exhausted that I immediately fell asleep. At the same moment a nurse came into my room and saw that I was lying beside my bed. There was a lot of sand around me. She immediately started calling for help. The next day, this nurse was telling her colleague if she knew of a patient named Sun Jinwoo. She had heard that there was such a hunter who was now resting in their hospital, but it turns out that he runs every day, even though it has been several days since he woke up. The doctor said that hunters heal faster than ordinary people, so light exercise is helpful. But when they looked out the window, they saw that I was still running. But I was running and I didn't realize what all this easy exercise was, and I didn't realize if it was good that I was doing it. But I had been running for almost 4 hours since I woke up, and there were a few things I managed to learn. The first is that the thing in front of my eyes is not an illusion. For I can clearly see with my own eyes, though no one else can. And when I finally completed the last quest, the 10K run, I got my reward for the quest and was able to pick one of the cells. It was a status recovery, and at one point I got magic that could heal my fatigue after training. The fatigue that didn't make them all in my body actually disappeared, as if it hadn't happened at all. Also, I still had stats and random boxes, and I can improve any character trait until I run out of points. I get stronger when I increase a player's stats, and this level up does the same thing. Yes, and the skill status, inventory, and stored items all felt like a game. I never figured out what was really going on, but at this point in my characteristics I was level A. My strength was 10, intelligence 10, dexterity 10, perception 10, and toughness 10. I still had 3 points left that I could use. In the evening, I went to the front desk and asked if I could leave tonight, as I had some business to take care of outside. A little later I found myself outside the subway entrance, and it was time to find out what this thing was in my hands. After all, every time a random box appeared after completing a daily task, sometimes it contained unnecessary items. But what I was holding in my hands was something else entirely. It was a key that allows me to instantly create a dungeon, and I can use it in the third entrance to Hair Station. This key allows me to instantly create a dungeon, and I wondered if this could all be because of an overactivation or possible overactivation procedure. But if it was, I should try it, because finally the weakest hunter in the world gets overactivated. Others would have laughed upon hearing this, but I was confident in my ability to escape, and if it was as dangerous as the last time, I would escape despite all obstacles. As soon as I inserted the key, a portal opened, into which I immediately entered. As soon as I stepped out of the portal, I was notified that I had entered an instant dungeon. However, the entrance behind my back instantly closed, and suddenly a girl walked beside me, just passing by. I realized that it was some other dimension, because it didn't look like a normal dungeon, and I had never seen anything like it before. Perhaps it must be like a red gate. Now I didn't know what to do, because I was planning to run away if something went wrong. If the exit had closed, I couldn't get out of here. A little later I got a notification that I couldn't leave the dungeon until I killed the boss. It was kind of weird, since it had been days since I had fought Irang monsters, and now I had to clear all the dungeons myself. I had a strange feeling inside, as if someone was mocking me. After all, they were seriously counting on me to be able to deal with this without a team. I guess I overestimated my capabilities. After all, I seriously thought I could handle it without the group, but when I started to move on, I saw that everything around me was destroyed, as if an apocalypse had occurred. I kept walking, but I felt less and less confident, because there was a strong ominous atmosphere all around me. It was a monster running right at me. I saw some monster leap at me, but I managed to dodge it, and it rushed past me. And when I turned around, I saw a wolf in front of me. It was Riken's Steel Fong. I realized that even 1 or 2 goblins was hard for me. Could I defeat a monster as terrible as him? After all, he was much stronger than I was, and much bigger. And at that moment I felt that my legs stopped listening to me, and I simply could not move. It was all because I was afraid and I was too scared. I didn't think I had suffered any serious psychological trauma at the time, but the monster kept attacking me. It would have bitten my leg off just a little more, but I successfully jumped aside. I didn't have a healer at the moment, and I couldn't afford to get hurt. In an instant, the monster was already near my head. A little more and it would have bitten it off, but my body was so light that I successfully dodged it. I was very surprised, because this had never happened to me before, and then I realized that I was much stronger than I'd been before. I looked straight into his eyes, and barely saved my life. Now I would not tremble with fear, I would fight. I swung and struck that wolf with my hand, which made it fly away and make a hole in the nearest fence. I was surprised at how strong I was, and realized it was probably because of my improved strength. But the Rikon Steel Fawn was still stronger than me. I kept hitting him as he got closer to me. Right up close. And, just as I thought, the usual attacks had no effect on him, and even this monster was stronger than me. This became a problem for me, and I didn't know what to do. After all, it was too hard for me alone, and this wolf managed to hurt me. I realized that I could not defeat it by myself or with the help of a group, healers, or equipment. I had nothing left after that. I began to think what it would take for me to defeat such a powerful monster, and all I had was my body, a weapon with magical power. And if only I had a weapon. But, sure, I had inventory. And as soon as I thought about the inventory, it immediately opened up, and the only thing I had there was a sword, and I was able to get it right out of the inventory. I didn't understand why it was there, but that was the least of my worries, for I now had the most terrifying opponent in front of me, and with a single blow I cut the wolf in half. It was the blade that Master Kim had left in the double fong. My level was elevated. I remembered that Mr. Kim had bought it for 3 million won. It was too expensive for me, because I couldn't afford such a weapon. But now I am going to use it. This inventory I have turned out to be quite a handy thing. After all, I can store anything I want in here. Ever since I got the gun, I'm no longer afraid of those horrible monsters coming right at me. But suddenly I realized that I couldn't lift this sword off the ground. I started pulling it with all my might. Behind me were 2 horrible wolves, coming closer and closer. Finally, I was able to move it and hit one of the wolves. The other wolf grabbed my sword with its iron steel fangs, and then I realized that it was called Steel Fong for a reason. But I could not let Mr. Kim's sword go to waste, and in the end, I was able to chop that wolf in 2. Now that I think about it, those wolves compared to those monsters are too weak for me. Now I can overpower them all and survive at all costs by becoming much stronger. After I defeated those 2 wolves, I found a secluded spot and sat on the ground and pondered. It seems that when I level up, all my characteristics increase by 1 point, and completing a daily task earns me 3 points. Leveling up means that all my characteristics increase by 1. Right now I have 5 points, and I'm wondering how much stronger I can get. Monster hunting and leveling up seem to be the most effective. I wanted to see how much I could improve my characteristics. Even my intelligence and perception can be expressed in numbers, but the important thing is to understand my strength. It has only increased by 10 points, but I already feel an improvement. Is it possible that my characteristics will still improve? Anyway, I understand that I can get stronger as my level increases. Having just defeated 2 monsters, I wondered why the magic cores hadn't fallen off them. After all, I thought all the monsters in the dungeon had such cores. It seemed to be a separate kind of monster. Suddenly an interesting thought occurred to me. If I am under the control of the game system, then probably both the dungeon and these monsters are created by a special system. Perhaps that's why items rather than magic cores fall off of them. After all, I was able to get Ryan's Fong, which turned out to be quite large, and now I can keep it in my inventory or sell it in the store. But when I tried to sell it, the notification showed that my level wasn't high enough to make the purchase. Beginners can't seem to use this feature. I was offered 20 gold coins for this Fong, and I don't even know how much it's really worth, since it's virtual money. But it looks like this dungeon is supposed to be high level, E rank, and it's probably not worth it. I had to decide what to do now, because I can't leave until I beat the boss. I could leave if I got the return crystal, but I don't know if that would even happen. Besides, I'll soon run out of food, even if the boss is too strong to fight him alone. However, it should become possible if I level up a little more, but then I might die before I even encounter him. So I decided that I would destroy any monsters that came near me, and then I would go straight to the boss and deal with him for what it was worth to me. For I have nothing to fear, for I have already died once, and I will not let it happen a second time. I destroyed every wolf that came my way, and each time there were more and more. But as soon as my level rose and stopped, I became even stronger and killed them with ease. For I had decided that I would not give up so easily. So these wolves must not die too easily either, or I would feel sorry for them. I must fight fiercely, as hard as my body can take it. Finally, I realized that if I didn't leave here, I would be killed. Gradually, as I leveled up, I realized that if I died, I wouldn't be able to protect the people I cared about. In the end, I would lose everything I had. I can't just put my hands down like a weakling if I can get stronger. I will even follow these absurd rules, just to survive and keep moving forward, protecting everything I hold dear. And when I have dealt with all the wolves that were in my way, I thought that would be the end of it. In the next hallway, I saw more wolves coming right at me. I was having a hard time, and my body almost didn't listen to me. I knew I could win and continue on my way. Well, at one point during the battle I realized that the blade of my blade was completely blunt, and it would eventually lose its strength. Even if I bought a high-end weapon, it would inevitably become the same when I went down into the dungeon a few more times. There was one occasion when I bought a dagger that cost over 50,000 won. Although it became much easier to hunt, the dagger still broke easily in a boss battle, and I got 3 magic crystals that day. But I still couldn't afford to buy weapons, even though it was exhausting. I decided that I would take care of them one by one using my body. I was grateful for this blade, for it had saved my life more than once today. In the end, I received the title of Wolf Killer. This title is awarded to a hunter who skillfully fights wolves. It increases experience against beast-type monsters by 40%. I was able to get 34 wolf fangs and 2 worn daggers, a traveler's clothing and a return stone. It was more than I expected, but this return stone was too tempting. I didn't know if I should go back, but there was no guarantee that there would be another chance to get stronger so easily. And what would happen to this dungeon after I used the return stone? Will it just disappear? If it's some sort of system-created limited event, then it's very real. And I end up dancing, palm splashing, something I don't know myself. Like a dance on the palm of the Buddha's hand, I stood and pondered whether I should go on or just back off. But at the end, I put the stone back in my inventory and headed forward. After all, I wanted to get stronger, and with each step I was able to raise my level higher and higher. 4. When I fight monsters, I feel a little better and I definitely feel like I'm getting stronger. Unlike normal dungeons where monsters are reborn, these creatures don't feel alive. So fighting them is more like a game where their character is determined. If I can learn their behavior, I can understand where they come from. Perhaps there is a monkey on top and a cat on all sides. I fought them all alone, and was able to defeat them all. For I am much stronger now than before. I'm different now. As they attack me, if a month ago I would have died a long time ago, but now I know how to behave in such situations. In this case, the color of their name changes depending on their strength. White means weak, orange means strong, and red means very strong. At first the color of the Raiken's name was orange, but now it's white and I'm a little stronger. But even with the strength I have now, I'm not sure I can beat that guy. Now I started getting goosebumps when I saw the smoke heading one way. And it's probably due to the increase in my sensitivity, and I can appreciate how powerful the monster is down there. My level doesn't seem to be rising anymore. Besides, my sword won't last long if I fight in vain. Finally, I decided that I needed to go down and see for myself what was waiting for me down there. I kept going down, and I realized that the stairs had gotten longer, and it was a real subway station. And when I finally made it down the stairs, I saw this strange place. And suddenly something fast started rushing right at me, and before I could even blink, something hit me hard with its big tail. But I managed to parry this blow with my sword, but I was still thrown back into the nearest wall, which hit me very hard and made me bleed. I sat and stared at the terrifying monster. And suddenly something fast started rushing right at me, and before I could even blink, something hit me hard with its big tail. But I managed to parry this blow with my sword, but I was still thrown into the nearest wall, which hit me very hard and made me bleed. I sat and stared at the terrifying monster. I stood in front of this horrible monster and looked him straight in the eye. At that moment I realized that the sword could not pierce it, and the blows would have no effect. I need to figure out how to deal with him quickly, because I'm almost out of time. The monster kept attacking, and I realized that I needed a very quick full weight attack. At the same time, I have to weaken this guy's defense. But I have to decide how I'm going to deal with this thick scales. After all my attacks could not penetrate his thick scales, and something had to be done about it. I tried to dodge and defend myself, but I would have died if he had hit me with a straight punch. However, in the end he managed to hit me several times, causing me to be very badly hurt and fall to the ground. Was this the end I had been walking toward all my life? I thought I'd gotten a lot stronger, but it wasn't enough. And how strong would I have to get to kill a monster like that? After all, to escape my past, I am the weakest hunter in the whole world. There had been such rumors about me lately. I remembered being told that there seemed to be people who do such things for fun, and I need to make more of an effort to stop these rumors. This nickname stuck to me because I'm too weak, but I shouldn't brag about my weakness. For I myself know how weak I am, and it is a force that clutches my head and can make me back down. Even false pretenses cannot protect me. And whatever the enemy does, the sheer force of me in fear will make my knees bend and my toes dig into the ground. I am ignored because I am weak or have not been thanked before the force. I thought back to that very day when many men and good hunters died, but I stayed alive. So I have to survive right now. If it is easy to be betrayed, then I must become stronger. For this is where I must overcome all obstacles, and no matter what, I will recover and continue my journey to reach my goals that await me. For I must become even stronger, and all the monsters in my path will fall. Compared to this monster and the fear I felt then, I am completely calm now. Even if there is a monster in front of me that surpasses me in strength, I will still be able to deal with it. I grabbed hold of this big family's neck and wouldn't let it go. I squeezed her as hard as I could, but she resisted me. There were every wall around us that could be. I was choking her with all my strength and screaming for her to die soon. Eventually she began to suffocate. At this time in the hospital, the doctor was asking if I was back in my room. He was wondering why I hadn't come back even after the sun went down. But the nurse at the front desk said that I was almost healthy and would be discharged soon. But the doctor wasn't sure about the hunters, and they should stabilize me in that room, because he had heard it said that high-class hunters, rich and broad class, don't get much money and are in constant danger. And he didn't understand why we were doing such a job. After all, it's horrible to watch the conditions in which hunters work, and it was interesting what they do inside the dungeon. The veterans they get is abnormal. They are covered in blood completely on another level from patients who get into accidents, and it was amazing that they are still alive in these conditions. But the nurse thought it was a miracle since they were able to return from the dungeon, but the doctor said he disagreed, for even the weakest hunters are strong compared to ordinary people. Correct the text for errors, because you can assume they are the same as those monsters in the dungeons. At this time I was finally able to kill that monster, and a notification showed me that I had upgraded. I finally sighed, and now I was sure that I was a little stronger than I had been before. If the next alert showed that I had killed the ruler of the swamp, the blue venomous dewclaw fawn, I could be rewarded with bottles of purified dewclaw venom. It can be obtained by killing a dewlap, and there is a slim chance of its skin falling out, which will become stronger. It will, however, weaken my strength. I also got a dagger made from a dewclaw fawn, and it can paralyze because of the venom on the blade. It gives the effect of bleeding, and I can carry it with me, keep it, or sell it. My clothes were torn to shreds, and my sword was also broken. My whole body was torn like a lat ball, but I finally got a better blade than the one Mr. Kim had. This dagger was made of fawn, not bone, and it had twice the attack characteristics of my last blade. It also has the effect of paralyzing and bleeding. At the time I decided to sell it, I received a new notification that the boss had been killed and the interior of the dungeon would return to its normal state. I looked up and saw everything around me start to disappear, and it was finally over. I started to go to the surface, and I wondered what time it was. But as soon as I got to the top, I saw a soldier, and he started asking me questions about how I was able to get out of there and why I hadn't heard about the transmission. I didn't understand what happened, but when he saw my sword and my shabby clothes, he realized I was a hunter and immediately apologized to me. He said he would see me off, but I wondered what had happened here. After all, there was devastation everywhere and a pile of dead monsters. I realized that a gate had probably opened nearby, and all those monsters were coming out of there. The soldier told me not to worry, those monsters that were nearby had already been destroyed, only one big monster was left on the left. Because of my sensitivity I could feel. I saw a bright light not far away. It was a boss, and besides, it was very big. A lot of hunters were fighting him, the likes of tanks, and the likes of ranged hunters, archers, and mages. At this time, the soldiers asked not to take pictures of it all and to leave the area immediately. But they were interested in what the hunters were doing and how long they would fight. After all, I want them to deal with it as quickly as possible, but at this time, the battle of the hunters was very fast, and some were wounded because of it. Some hunters were screaming for a quick cure for the tank that was holding back the boss's attacks, but all the hunters who were nearby could handle him, because his defense was very strong, and they didn't have that many mages who could handle him. I realized that the mistakes arose because they had only recently been summoned, and also because of their lack of effectiveness as a team. Their too little guy won't be able to do damage since he is a tank. It's a battle of attrition, and healers can't handle such serious wounds. But suddenly I saw that girl Jihu that I recently went through a double dungeon with. She was a B-rank healer and was helping these guys at the moment. However, something strange was going on with her, as she was trying to help, but remembered the horror she had recently gone through. She did not want to back down, for after that she could not go back. And even after a week she still hadn't overcome it, and that was to be expected. After all, I have to overcome it too, and the boss around D rank compared to the boss I fought before is one rank lower. If I can weaken his defense, I can beat him, because I need a punch that will penetrate that stupid rock. I gathered all my strength and threw my blade with all my speed. It flew straight at the head. At this time, the hunters who had been fighting the boss realized that if this continued, they would die. They should only hope that a hunter of rank above them would come, and the tank in front of them might die. At this rate. And at that moment my sword flew to the target, and the boss was killed. But the hunters who fought him thought they were the ones who killed him. The hunters kept attacking him, but the boss was already disintegrating, for he was destroyed by my sword, which I threw. Finally, the boss fell, and all the hunters rejoiced that they could defeat him, but some of them guessed that I hadn't fought him before. Now he suddenly collapsed. One guy with a shield realized that their attacks had accomplished nothing, and he realized that something flew into him that helped kill the boss and blew his head off. He stepped closer, saw the sword sticking out of his head, and couldn't believe that such a boss had been defeated by him. But he wondered who had thrown it. The hunter turned around and asked the soldier if he saw who threw that sword. But the soldier started to look around and said that he had been here somewhere, that there was another hunter here. And its power, its destructiveness. He's a hunter high up in the mountains, but at this time I stood and watched, for I didn't think he was going to die. His health was lower than I thought, and Jihu probably saw me, too. The next day I was in my hospital room, training as hard as I could, because now I should be stronger than before. But at one point a nurse came into my room and saw me doing push-ups off the floor. When I saw her, I apologized and got to my feet. However, she was embarrassed to see me without outerwear. She looked at me and thought about how this patient and his body were the same when he was admitted here. After all, he had somehow changed, and it had been a few days. She asked me when I was being discharged from the hospital. I answered that today. And she held up her phone to me and asked if I would mind if she had my phone number. At first I didn't understand what she needed it for, but then she said it was for the results she would send me later. Seconds later I gave her my number. The next day I was already at my apartment, at which point my sister was getting ready for school. But at that time I opened my door and started walking out. I was very sleepy. I saw my sister and told her that if she was going to school, she should be careful of the cars on the road. But she was more interested in my view, because she realized that I had been working half the night as a hunter. When she approached me, she asked that my body looked trim. And she realized that I had gotten a little taller. She didn't think men were still growing after 20 years, but I told her to cut the crap and get an umbrella, because it looks like it's going to rain. But she didn't want to take it, but I insisted, because this folding umbrella wasn't that big, and she'd had enough of making such a fuss about it. Soon she was gone, at which point I looked at my daily assignments and decided I would go for a run a little later. I noticed that my muscles got bigger, and there's no way that my physical status has changed in just a few weeks. So my status is affecting my body as I continue to increase my strength. Most likely my body is changing too, and it's probably because I put a lot of points into the strength box. And I wondered what would happen if I kept going. I hope I don't become a big overpumped dumb jock. Even having a high level is not good without balance. The same will be true for the other stats. And since the synergy between strength and dexterity is good, I'll put some into that. High health is also good, but the higher the stamina, the better. But the problem was still with intelligence, and it seems to be related to magic. But did I need it? I wondered. And when I put all my free points into strength, agility, perception, endurance, and intelligence, everything was now fine. At that moment suddenly I heard the phone ringing for me. And when I picked up the phone, I was told it was from the guild. They were nervous because I hadn't picked up the phone in a very long time. But I apologized and told them that something had happened to me recently, and I had just gotten out of the hospital. But that person was calling me because a month's rent was already trickling in. He asked if I could pay now. If not, could he defer my payment for a month? But I replied that it was okay, I would transfer the money soon. As I hung up the phone, I began to realize that this was a double awakening. And if I really got the double awakening, then I am capable of making money. If I continue to grow at this rate, I could soon become a cool hunter, because hunters kill monsters and make money. The higher the experience, the higher the reward and more worth of magic crystals. To defeat a high-level monster, you have to enter the same level gate. Thus, there is a lot of competition, and low-ranked hunters can enter the gate of rank D or E. Therefore, E-rank hunters are not accepted into guilds. And even if it were the other way around, it would still be problematic for them to find work. Right now my rank in the guild is E, and for me, who has never entered a D rank gate, that would be a prerequisite. People are chosen on the basis of competence. And when I could not yet rid myself of the title of the weakest hunter in the world, should I work well and raise my rank? That question plagues me above all else. My awakening will turn into a wildfire, and people love to gossip. Hunting is a good topic, and the more attention I get, the better I get paid. But angry looks will come over me, and I can't reveal myself until I'm sure. I'll make money first, and it would be great if I could increase my attack power first. The next day I was already near one of the dungeons, and as I got closer, one guy said to go this way. When I got close to him, he said his name was Dongsu and asked what my name was. I answered that my name was Sun Jinwu, and I was an E-ring hunter. The other guys, as soon as they saw me, said that they knew me and I was a pretty famous person. They started remembering my nickname, and finally one of those guys said it was the weakest hunter in the world after all. But the big guy who was standing next to me ordered them to stop and said that the most important thing was quantity. As he said on the phone, it would be a little difficult for me, since it was a C-rank gate, and I would be exempt from fighting for the time being, but he would pay me 2 million to add to our lineup. It was a good deal for me, and he held out his hand for me to sign. After that, I looked at them and saw that there were 5 C-ranks and 4 D-ranks. There is a rule that when entering a C-rank gate, there must be 10 or more people, and at least half of them must be C-rank. Because of this, there have been times when the strength of a squad is only a few. As I was looking over my contract, some guy came up to me, apologized, and told me that we were both still green today. It was Jin Ho. He was 22 years old and had a D rank at this point. He, too, was called up under the same circumstances as me. When I looked up and saw him at full height, it was strange to me, because he was wearing a stupid outfit. But to hell with the darling. I guess he was the son of a millionaire. At this point the head of that hike came up to us and said I should just follow them and take care of the luggage. There's food, clothes, gear, first aid kits, and just about everything you need. And I understood that we would go there without a healer. After that he replied that it was hard for me to understand, but that they could take care of themselves, because they always do. But to me that was silly, for the squad consisted only of tanks and attackers. I continued to read my contract and saw that it said that I acknowledge that I will not blame anyone else for any accidents inside the dungeon and the fact that they did not have a healer. That would be hard to accept. The guys finally started screaming for everybody to go inside, and they're going to beat the monsters anyway. And there was no need to worry about that. And as soon as we started going inside, that guy in the other outfit told me to stop worrying so much about it, because he would take care of me. Here was the time. We were near the entrance of the building and began to gather our equipment. Everyone took their swords and clothes, and I, at the time, slung a large briefcase of equipment and food on my shoulders. We began to move, and along the way the head began to say that it looked like construction had been delayed. Most recently, just 2 weeks ago, the chief had fled abroad with millions, with workers and sponsors left behind. Hard times had come, but I didn't understand why he wasn't talking about it. When I put my bag on, this guy asked me if it would be too hard for me to carry it all and if I would be okay. But I said it wasn't that heavy, and I thanked my strength, because now a bag like that would be nothing to me. That guy started telling me again to stop being so strict or it was okay to be so quiet. But I answered him that he talked too much, for he was boring me with his excessive chatter, and I realized that people tended not to pay much attention to him. And he replied that being a hunter was his hobby, but that somehow made me feel uncomfortable. Finally we came to the entrance of the dungeon, but the entrance was quite large. It was rather unusual. One of the guys asked the head if he was sure about the state of the gate from the orang, because it looked too big. But the head replied that he hoped the guild was reliable, because he had seen people go in and out of there many times. I was looking at that guy in the expensive clothes, and I thought he was coming to the raid for the first time, because he was a little freaked out by the fact that the gate looked big. But the size of the gate isn't that important, because what matters most is the magical energy that flows out of the gate and determines the quantity and quality of that energy. It is then given a rank, and the big guilds take care of gates higher in rank, and gates with lower ranks aren't as dangerous. I realized that, though this was my first trek from rank. The head decided to go in first and told everyone else to follow her. We were ready, and that guy pulled out his big, clean sword as well as his big shield. I looked at him and realized that usually hunters of D or rank like me don't make enough money to buy good weapons. Not to mention the bills. But why did this D hunter have such good equipment? I looked at everyone else and realized that it seems to be making good money. After all, everyone is perfectly equipped, and it's all very different from the dungeons D and E ranks I've been in. And when we went inside, it was too dark, so one of the guys used his magic and lit a big fireball. When the cave lit up, they didn't understand what it was and why there were no monsters here. Also, there were no lights anywhere, although it was normal for a dungeon to have a few glowing stones. Jinho asked me if there were no monsters in the dungeon, but I asked him to be quiet. I started listening and realized that if there are no lights here, it means that monsters like darkness. It's usually not easy for them to live in dark dungeons, but if they're unintelligent, it's likely that these monsters don't rely on sight, they move in groups and live in the dark, darting around for light. When I heard the sound, I shrieked, realizing that it was a monster from the insect class, and it was probably an ant's nest. The sound came closer and closer, but we couldn't see them. The tunnel was too dark. Some of the guys started to panic, but I yelled for everyone to look up, and we all raised our heads and saw that they started to appear from above, right above us. Although we didn't realize how many there were, they were all coming down from the ceiling. There were too many of them, and so the battle began. One of the mages used his fire magic and dealt with the insects. The other guy with the shield started screaming and using his aura to get them closer. It turned out that our head was a damager. That's who in the group does most of the damage. I stood behind and watched these hunters and saw that they had a tough job. With this kind of work, they can put together a team without healers. Leader Don Sok was doing his duty well, and they had his back at home. Most likely, they were already fighting side by side. I understood that this was because they always put a team together without healers, and they are a little tough. At this point, Jinho and his equipment was good. It covered the lack of experience and skill. Everything was doing well, but it was a little disappointing to me. After all, I was expecting a slightly different kind of dungeon. The group leader started to say that we would be back after we cleaned up at the entrance, and that might take a while. So don't overexert yourself too much and control your powers. We also need to collect all the magic crystals and divide them among the 9 participants. After all, this was my favorite part of the job. Suddenly, however, the leader came up to me and asked how I knew the monsters would attack from above. I replied that I just felt it. In fact, my perception allows me to feel more than my eye can see. Afterwards, everyone participated and thanked me, telling me that I would feel better if I didn't pay attention to such little things. I didn't fully understand what they meant. A little later, we began to look at the insect wounds and realized that they were not any wounds. We had mutilated them as if they had been bitten off, not burns from magic. It turned out that these monsters were already like that before we fought them. There's a territorial feud between them, which means there are monsters here that are stronger than these guys. The leader got excited about this because it could be a boss or someone else. And that means there's a lot of money here. At this point, I asked Jinho what kind of sword he was holding that looked very expensive. He replied that it was, and that his father had decided to reassure himself when he heard he was going on his first raid. I told him I wasn't sure, but he should be more careful. I had a bad feeling someone was up to something. We kept walking forward, and I realized that regardless of rank, the size of the dungeon varies, and depending on the circumstances, it could be that it takes weeks to explore the inner passages, or it could be that it's only a couple of hours before you've reached a room. This dungeon is built like a labyrinth, so we didn't have many battles. It did take some time to move, however, although I don't really need to get into battles while I'm dragging my luggage. I thought it was a decent deal, but suddenly a warning popped up to make me wary of lizards. I didn't know why it appeared, but the one thing I was sure of for sure was that my bad feeling was never wrong. And a little later the leader began to say that this is serious, because quite a lot of time has passed, but we still have not found monsters with whole limbs. There are only the corpses of dying monsters. However, there must be a boss here, and if there wasn't one, the gate wouldn't open. But suddenly we froze, and the leader asked his comrade to light their way, which was right in front of them. And when the light came on, we were all frightened, for we saw many monsters shrouded in cobwebs. Rather, we realized that the boss room was waiting for us next, at which point everyone got ready. We were already ready for the battle and went a little further in, but when we went inside, all the guys were surprised. After all, they saw mana crystals. There were so many of them, it looked amazing. Although they were worth less than the crystals dropped from the monsters because of their low energy, but since there were so many of them, it meant that they could bring even more profit than magic crystals. Everyone looked at it and realized that they could get over 10 million. The leader began to look up and think about how his older brother wasn't always right, because he ignored him simply because he got a high rank and traded his country for America just for the money. The leader said he was still considered an elite in America and his brother should not think of him as a despicable man who would grovel at his feet. He decided to capitalize on the situation and increase his squad. At the same time, the other fellows began to say that it was a share of the big catch. And even if they split the amount, it would be $1 million each. But suddenly I heard Jinho ask me to give him my contract that I had signed earlier. He wanted to examine it thoroughly, and when he did, he turned to us all and said he had an urgent question. He showed my contract to the leader and started saying that it doesn't say anything about sharing magic crystals except those that fell out of monsters. That means we have to divide the mana crystals among the 10, not the 12. But the leader turned with his strange smile and said that of course we will divide everything equally, that he already knows perfectly well. But there was one thing that had to be dealt with first. It was a huge spider that was sitting right above us. The guys from that raid realized it was a dungeon boss that was sitting right above us and looking at us with his big red eyes. The leader started saying that everyone should understand that if the boss is defeated, the gate will close. Therefore, we must retrieve and transfer the mana crystals before we can defeat the spider. Luckily, it looks like he's asleep after stuffing his stomach, and this is the perfect chance to transfer the crystals. But first we have to bring the equipment. To this the other guy replied that who would have guessed we'd find crystals in a C-rank dungeon, and he left the miner's equipment in the car. But the leader started saying he was an idiot and telling him to make a habit of carrying it with him. They apologized to us and asked Jin and me to watch the place for the two of us, and they had to go and get our gear. Jinho was agitated, for he had heard everything right, that we should be left alone with the boss. But the leader began to say that he didn't think he would attack us, unless, of course, we invaded his territory ourselves. He seems to have had enough and is now napping, and everything will be fine as long as we don't provoke him. We have to trust the leader and keep our voices down, because something might happen if we keep talking loudly. The leader says he has something to tell the others, so they go and have a smoke and come back soon. I watched them leave and realized that according to the rules there had to be at least 10 people in the squad, not counting me and Jinho, and there were 8 in our squad. And that means that they repeatedly did so. Since they went into the gate that way, surely there would have been no need to fill the 2 empty spaces here. As soon as the leader and his group withdrew, he ordered that the entrance to the boss's room be blocked. And as soon as we heard the loud sound, we realized that everything had been stoned. And then it finally dawned on me that you guys are revealed to be lizards. I remembered being told that sometimes there are bastards like lizards, and incidents inside the dungeon are rare, because it's a pretty dangerous job. And even if a crime has occurred, it's hard to investigate. That's why this is often the place they use. There are no cameras that can be viewed from the outside. So who's going to stop the hunters? No one. Fix the text for mistakes, and the weaker you are, the quicker you just get rid of you. But if you are strong, people will reach out to you. If they say you're useless or in the way, they'll get rid of you like a lizard shedding its tail. That's why I was told to be careful. After all, I was the weakest hunter in the world. At this time I began to panic and didn't know what to do. After all, the entrance was backed up. He was upset that these bastards were trying to kill us, and they wanted to kill us. At this time, I realized that I wouldn't have been able to stop them anyway, because we had already fallen into the trap they had set. If we did anything, they were already ready to kill us. I remembered the leader telling me that it was all clear because of me, but it would have been all right if I hadn't paid attention to the little things. Now I knew what he meant. I threw my backpack on the ground and remembered that the guy who was the light mage's name was Guwon. He'd done a good job, and getting out of here wasn't that difficult. But the real problem was that this explosion had awakened the dungeon boss with rank. At this time, the group that had abandoned us started coming out of the dungeon. They said that since they had memorized the way out of here, it would be easy to get back after the break. Another guy started saying that we should just kill them there and everything would be a lot easier. But the leader started saying that if we put up a fight and wake up the spider boss, how could we get the mana crystals? The weakest E-ranked hunter and the D-ranked hunter, who has no experience, have no chance to deal with the boss. Despite their best efforts, after the boss spider eats them and goes to sleep, we can take advantage of this and get the mana crystals. If this works, we have to kill the boss. And then there's the whole Jinho outfit. It looks like we can get 1,000,001 with the sword and shield alone, but if we can't get all the mana crystals, we can still get his stuff in the end. The leader decided to find out what kind of rich family he came from, because at least we need to arrange a funeral for him, since the Rastasina caused a big ruckus. The boss is now furious, and none of this group has the courage to fight this monster alone, for it is impossible. Not even the leader would dare do it. Despite their best efforts, the two hunters will not be able to survive anytime soon. We stood and watched as the big boss spider approached us. Jinho ordered me to stay behind, and he would figure something out. Jinho looked at this monster and began to say that he had many eyes, a hideous mouth and huge size, long legs. His power is on a completely different level. Jinho didn't know where I was before and that I had met a horrible monster a month ago. The thought of him terrifies me. I said it was nonsense and started walking towards this boss. My dagger already appeared in my hand. I said that this monster was mine and I would destroy it myself, but he didn't understand what I was trying to do. I replied that of course I would finish him off. He thought I was crazy. After all, he knew it was impossible to defeat a boss on your own, unless you were an elite or higher in the city. He didn't understand how I could beat him, but I told him to think harder about getting out of here. In a way he was right. Even after waking up I was still weak, but I wondered why I didn't feel much pressure to bring me to my knees. The Azure Basilisk Swamp Lord I had met in that dungeon was too strong for an E-rank boss, perhaps he was even taller. The boss golem was rank D or lower, and compared to them this boss was incredibly strong. Perhaps this means that I became serious enough not to tremble in fear of a boss of my rank. My failing level was 18, and I was able to defeat this boss. This giant spider rushed right at me, but I jumped up and hit it with my blade. As a result, the monster started screaming, and I realized that my attacks were successful. My Rasaki Fong turned out to be a pretty good weapon, and that explains why hunters are called hunters, because of their desire to kill. Now the real hunting was just beginning. I started running straight ahead. He looked at me with his mouth open and didn't understand what I was doing. He watched me fight, and realized that this was the E-rank hunter. I kept fighting this horrible monster, but it was easier for me to dodge all his attacks and block his big tentacle blows with my speed. I was able to hit him on his big legs, even though his shell was very strong. I needed to plunge the dagger as deep as possible to damage it. After a couple of minutes of fighting, I realized that it had no blind spots. The spider has 8 legs and can easily penetrate the floor or rocks. Every attack can be deadly. It takes time to get close to him. I kept attacking with all my might. Jinho looked at all this and did not understand who I was, an E-rank hunter. But for him it was impossible to believe, because the guild said that I was definitely an E-rank. However, my movements did not seem so, and he probably realized that I was a false rank. After all, there are those among the hunters who can control their level of magical power. If they wanted to, they could lower their rank. Hunters who hide their true power are called pseudo-rangers. And the problem is that pseudo-rans are mostly psychopaths who kill for their own pleasure. Jinho looked at me, a look full of rage. I looked even more horrible than the monster himself. In that moment, fear possessed him, and he didn't know why he said he was coming here. After all, he should have listened to his father when he said it wasn't for me. I fought the monster, and I wondered how long it took. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes? Because of that, my stamina was slowly running out. I didn't even have time to hit him. The problem was that as my fatigue increased, my speed dropped, and I couldn't prolong the battle any longer. The only chance I had of winning was in the special ability of my dagger. I decided to use it against him. After all, I had the paralysis effect, the bleeding effect, and the weak spot on my head, the eyes, which are the weakest part of the head in all living creatures. However, I didn't expect this spider to spit its horrible acid. When I saw the acid burn a hole near my feet, I realized that this spider was hiding a trump card up its sleeve and I was running out of time. If this continues, I need to shorten the distance faster and right now. I used my active jerk skill and got to this monster in the blink of an eye, instantly shortening the distance. At this point, I activated the paralysis effect, as I wanted to get it over with as soon as possible, but I couldn't deliver a critical hit. I needed to accelerate even faster. I was a little short. Jinho watched me and saw how fast I was, but she knew that my stamina would run out if I kept this up. I kept approaching this spider and was already close to it, but my fatigue was only 70%. At one point the spider hit me with its big foot, but it flew off, leaving a hole in the ground. I saw that the spider was about to strike one last time, and I remembered that I had a status recovery effect. I was able to apply it before that big paw reached me. At this point I was already over the spider and was able to thrust my dagger right into its eye. I took the dagger out and struck a few more blows. My paralysis effect was also activated, and the spider began to bleed. At this time my opponent was losing 1% of his health every second. I kept throwing more and more punches and finally delivered one last crushing blow. The system informed me that the dungeon boss had been defeated. At that point, my level went up and I was excited to get my daily quest reward. And if I didn't know what might have happened, Jinho stood at the side and watched the whole thing. He couldn't believe his eyes that I had single-handedly defeated the boss. He looked at me and realized that I was definitely a liar. He saw me with a horrified grin as I began to slice through just a spider to finish off my magic crystals. At that moment, Jinho turned to me and offered to put my magic crystals, which he was holding, in his backpack, at which point he held out his hand to me and said that I must be thirsty and should take this water. I didn't understand what was happening to him, for in an instant he picked up a pickaxe and started chiseling mana crystals. And then I realized that I was something of a savior to him, but at that moment the passageway, which had been blocked, collapsed, and I saw the guys who had abandoned us approaching us. Those guys walked in on us, and they had a leader at the head who looked at us and couldn't believe his eyes that we were all still alive. The boss was dead, and they didn't understand what had happened. They didn't believe that we could overpower him ourselves. But they probably thought that spider was just dumb and big, and they didn't pay attention to Jinho, who was able to rattle the boss. After all, that explains their victory. The leader underestimated us, and if he had known the special properties of his equipment, he might have helped. He must have killed him himself. He had no idea what special properties his equipment had. After all, becoming his enemy was too risky. At this point, the leader decided to poach Jinho to himself and said that he looked him up on the internet. After all, his outfit is too conspicuous. It turned out that he was the son of an important big shot, the famous chairman of the Eugene Construction Company. It was definitely his father, but Jinho replied, "So what?" The leader said that he certainly assumed he was from a wealthy family, but for it to really turn out to be true, he wanted to talk about what today they will give Jinho a chance if he kills Sun Jinwoo. He should kill him and join them. It's the only way to survive, or they'll both end up dead. The leader didn't understand why Jinho was slow. After all, no one will know about this anyway, since we are still in the dungeon. Jinho turned around to look me in the eye, but I told him it was okay, because it was. No wonder he betrays me, for I am weak. But suddenly Jinho took my side and decided to fight alongside me, and now those guys were deciding what to do. But the leader said it was stupid to kill a rich man's son, and we had to deal with the weak man first. As soon as they began to approach us, I saw that I had been given an emergency quest, and there would be a penalty for not completing the quest. I needed to kill 8 enemies. I didn't understand what it was, because the system suddenly gave me the instructions for the quest. I saw that it said that there were subjects nearby who intended to kill the player. I need to destroy them and ensure my safety. If the quest fails, my heart stops and I need to kill 8 enemies. But at that moment there was an explosion, and I flew far back and crashed into a nearby wall. At this time I didn't realize what had happened, and as soon as he turned around, he saw me. I was lying on my chest on the rocks. At this time, I didn't understand why it was me. I had forgotten that this place focuses on survival of the fittest. Nowhere else, and so far my thinking has been wrong. Have entered the dungeon many times and even overcame my limits, increased and entered the dungeon again. Always thought this place was safe, but enemies in the system force me to kill, and I have to kill them all if I don't want to be killed. It would be ridiculous if I were to die now, and it's not an accident or ill will, it's what the system needs. I saw that the system wants me to be strong. It was obvious to me. I realized that the system was using me, but I was going to use the system. The guy who hit me, they started joking around and saying that his skills had deteriorated, because after that hit he should have been dead already. But the leader told him to take it more seriously. The guy who hit me started saying that he had definitely put all his strength into that magic attack, because he had put in quite a lot of mana. But how could it have turned out like that? He missed. But at this point I was completely serious and started telling them that they were playing with people's lives and now they were going to have to face the consequences. But these guys didn't understand what I was telling them, but I was getting closer and closer, and I said that since they were hunters, they should be prepared to be targets themselves. And the first one standing said he would deal with me. As he approached me, he put his hand on my shoulder and said that I didn't seem to understand my situation very well. But before he could say another word, my blade was already at his throat, and I slashed it with one motion of my hand. A second later I dropped him to the ground, and everyone standing next to me was in shock. But I was serious and said that I was the first one ready, and now I only had 7 enemies to kill. The leader looked at me and didn't understand when I had time to pull out my dagger. The leader looked at me and realized that it didn't matter how unprepared I was, but his was a Dirang hunter. I was out of my mind, because it got to the point where I killed a man, and I could make all the excuses I wanted, that the system made me, but that wouldn't change the fact that I killed someone. After all, I must kill or be killed, and I can no longer run away from it all. If only the strongest are destined to survive, then I will only become strong so that what happened a month ago when I was studying in that double dungeon and where those horrible things happened that give me the creeps. It was when I first saw good hunters and good people die in horrible ways. We tried to survive, but in the end most were killed. I will never forget what happened to me, the way I was abandoned and ran away leaving me alone. I have seen strong hunters cry. Well, of course, in the end everyone left me. And I was left alone, wounded and exhausted, and I thought I could trust these men, but they abandoned me. Even though I was too good to them and helped them as much as I could. I am a different person now, not the same as I used to be. My eyes burn differently, and I look different. I have become more violent, and now no one can overpower me. After all, I didn't just come all this way to get here. I was too serious at this point, and there was a terrifying aura coming from me. But those guys in front of me weren't about to let their guard down and decided to take another wrong punch that sent me flying off into the wall. That mage started to attack me, but I ran aside and approached him in a flash, saying that his magic only annoyed me. I was able to cut through my second enemy, and everyone who was looking at me from those bastards began to run at me with the goal of finishing me off. As soon as they got close to me, I was able to kill my third enemy by cutting off his arm and stabbing him with my dagger. As he fell to the ground, the others were terrified, for they did not understand how I could move like that, and they could not manage to hit me. I was too fast for them, but I knew that sometimes hunters can be game for a tougher hunter. Now it was their time, and at one point I activated my paralysis skill, and the body of one of the attackers was unable to move. They thought it was some kind of magic, but I was too strong. Jinho, who was watching me, saw that I was a little stronger now than when I fought the dungeon boss. And the moment my bleeding paralysis hit my enemies, those guys were in terrible pain and didn't understand where I was coming from. But it was too late, and they all fell to the ground. Here was the last one left, and it was the leader of this gang. He couldn't believe it, because he saw it. For a moment I could make out his whole crew. He realized that I was hiding my powers and that I was the one who killed this dungeon boss. He didn't expect all his men to be defeated, so he decided to show me that not all rangers are the same. The leader used reinforcement and started flying straight at me, saying that it didn't matter what kind of monster I was. And after a fight with a boss and 7 hunters, I would be exhausted, because there was no way a tired hunter could penetrate his armor with some knife. And a hunter with an emphasis on speed and dexterity shouldn't have an ability that will pierce his reinforcement ability, and he'll die the moment he touches it. But the leader, the Don bitch, was strong. But something he didn't notice was the way I was already near him. I grabbed his head and slammed him to the ground. He didn't know that I kept raising my level. He was lying on the ground, covered in a pile of rocks, and he didn't understand what was happening. In the blink of an eye, I stomped his face into the ground. When he raised his head, he saw me standing over him with my blade in my hands and began to beg me to spare him. He promised to give me money and to give me all the mana crystals and magic stones. I didn't understand why he was asking for mercy from the man who had tried to kill him 3 times, but the leader didn't think I would get away with it. I ordered him to be quiet, for no one would know what had happened in that dungeon. At this point, the leader started screaming that I had no idea who his little brother was. Before he could even say his last word, I cut off his head and he fell to the ground. I stood there and saw that all my clothes were torn again. Also, they were getting a little small in size. I decided it was time for me to go to the store and buy myself something new. But when I got back, I saw that Jinho had gotten sick from what he'd seen. At that moment I realized that the boss of this dungeon had been defeated, and we needed to leave this place as soon as possible. 12:12. But at this time in Washington, USA, someone had a beautiful morning, and the guy who woke up wondering what time it was in Korea because he had a bad dream and even his eyes were moist as if he was crying in his sleep. A little later, in one of the buildings, a man came up to Jin Chul's manager and said that something had happened here. He began to explain that 8 people had died in the course of the dungeon, but the survivors were 2 hunters, D and E, both of rank. The manager reported and saw that it said they had just escaped, and that was quite normal. But the other guy said they didn't run away, they cleared the dungeon. He began to explain that the D-rank hunter Jinho was an incredibly high-ranked hunter and had a different outfit. Perhaps this allowed him to defeat the boss. The boss turned out to be the giant arachnid Bermura. He was not dangerous to organized groups, and it was strange that 8 people died. But the manager told him not to beat around the bush and said, if there wasn't anything unusual, you wouldn't be talking to me right now and decide for yourself. But the other man said that the other survivor was Hunter Song Jinwoo, from that very incident, and that seemed a little suspicious to the manager. She decided that they had nothing to worry about, because the magic power meter they were using at the time was a high-end item extracted from A-rank monsters, and overwaking is such a common occurrence, and they didn't need to become paranoid. 1 check is enough. But that guy also wanted to think it was just a coincidence, but he couldn't let it go so easily, because one of the dead was Hunter Dong Suk. The manager was talking about Hunter Huang Dong Su's older brother. In that case, he can't leave it that way, but I was at home in my apartment at the time and was sitting with my sister. My sister began to ask, why did I buy chicken wings? Unless something was wrong, but I told her that I hadn't figured out yet, good or bad. But my sister guessed something was wrong. After all, I'm usually such a cheapskate, but I was worried about another problem. I wanted to get drunk. No matter how much I drank, I didn't feel anything. But suddenly the notification system showed me that noxious substances had been detected, and my passive ability to be immune to poisons would cancel out the negative effects. And I realized that because of the ability issued to me by the system, it was now not even affecting me. And 3 seconds later, the negative effect was successfully cancelled. I remembered how I had received the reward the system had given me after I had passed that horrible dungeon. And how many things had happened lately that I just overlooked. And to think, I had been rewarded with something like that. Also, thanks to this reward for the mission, the leg I lost was restored. Suddenly it occurred to me that if I was no longer susceptible to all poisons, I decided to check it out. I got up and started walking away. My sister asked me if I wouldn't eat it, she could do it for me. I told her she could get as fat as she wanted, and my sister looked at me. It was hard for her to get used to me after I started my workouts. After all, I used to be so nonchalant. But she seems to be looking at me more seriously now. Sister realized that it was because something happened in the dungeon. When I went into my room, I decided to see if all the negative effects were automatically cancelled. Could my ability handle the negative effects of this item? But it didn't matter, so I decided to just check. And after 3 seconds, the negative effects were successfully cancelled. The effect of the object's poison dewlap and its muscle weakness were cancelled, and everything happened just as I thought it would. But suddenly my sister came into my room and asked me if I knew anyone named Jiho, as he was calling me on the phone. A little later I went into the cafe where I met the guy. When I went up to him, I asked him how he found my number, but he said it was all thanks to the guild. He had connections there. Soon after, he offered me a cup of coffee, but I declined. I was surprised to see him again, but he said I was his savior. I smiled, for he had shared magic stones with me, and I was able to earn some money. If anything, I was able to make almost $900 in taxes. And the fact that he kept his mouth shut didn't cause me any problems. But Jinho responded that the guys tried to kill us first, and that we were hunters, so we couldn't give up our lives so easily. And it was an internal showdown. Jinho sat there nervous, because he understood that I was hiding my rank and that I was a homicidal maniac. There was no way he would normally deal with someone like that. Eventually, I asked him, why did he call me? But afterwards Jinho told me that he was actually planning to start his own fighting guild. But I immediately said that I refuse and don't even want to listen to him if he hasn't already finished talking. After all, if he is forming a battle group and wants me to join, I still wondered what it would be. But I'm not going to babysit rich kids. If he doesn't have anything to add, I'll just leave. But Jinho got up and started saying that all I had to do was help him 19 times. After that I asked him if he wanted me to go to the dungeon with him 19 times. But he replied that he promised to split the loot fairly. I started to tell him that he should have realized by now that hunters not only happen to kill monsters, but people as well. Raiding is not an extreme sport, and even so, he still wants to assemble a battle group, and he won't change his mind, even after the horrors he's seen. I asked Jinho if he might want to be the head of the guild. Shortly thereafter, he replied that he did, and I should hear him out. After all, like I said, he wants a guild head license. For a hunter, it's not that hard to get. You can get a guild leader's license after you've been to at least 20 raids, and he's already been to one. There are 19 more to visit, and of course there is still an exam, but if he's going to be company, he's sure of himself here. I asked him what he thought of it, because he was the second son of Eugene Company, and rightly so. Jinho began to say that his becoming head of the guild was directly related to his company, and his father wanted to start a guild. And then I realized that although the dungeons are dangerous, on the other hand, there are simply mountains of treasure hidden in them, magic stones and monocrystals being only a small part. Even the corpses of monsters are useful for materials. There is nothing useless in dungeons. Of course, the business sharks are interested in all this, and the hunters sit on the company's payroll, surrendering everything found in the dungeons to them. In this way, they come out self-sufficient. Jinho began to say that his father planned to hire an S-rank hunter and make him head of the guild, and his brother would be the deputy, running the guild under the guise of assisting. However, I replied to Jinho that if my memory serves me correctly, there are only 9 S-rank hunters in our country. If my father plans to hire a hunter who is not registered with the guilds, the only option left is a min one, but he is retired now. And even if his brother becomes deputy head, the difference in authority is too great, and a division between the two factions will be inevitable. However, Jinho replied that his brother is gifted but not awakened, and he is not strong enough for the title of head. Given his age and low rank, he certainly won't get anywhere. I understood that he was planning to gain experience and respect so he could appeal to his father. I replied that this was the case, because if I continued to hide my capabilities, wouldn't I need like-minded people? After all, compared to going to dungeons with a high-ranking hunter, and the accomplishments of clearing dungeons with someone E-rank is much higher. But I answered him all he said, what I would get out of it. When Jinho handed me a folder with everything written on it, and I read it, I was very much surprised by what it said. I certainly didn't expect this. The next day, I asked my sister why she decided to come to practice with me. After all, it was hard to get her out of the house before. My sister started asking that she thought things were getting better for me lately, and anyway, it was better than sitting around doing nothing. I told her to keep up with me during this run, and while we were running, I decided to ask my sister, assuming she unexpectedly got 3 million won, what she would do with it. She didn't understand why I was asking that, and then she said she could buy a bigger house with it. And for the rest she never even thought about it. 3. My sister started asking me if it was too fantastic an amount and why exactly 3 billion won. But to me, that amount wasn't that fantastic. At this point, I started to run even faster, and my sister stayed behind me. She stopped and didn't understand why I started running so fast. But 3 billion was the amount Jinho offered me. After all, it's an assignment we're working on, and we plan to use it as a guild office. The estimated cost of this project is 3 billion won, but the price will go up. The $3 million building was bought by me for 19 trips to the dungeons. Heard from Jinho that it was a small price to pay for the opportunity to become the head of a guild, and it turned out to be just that. I started to wonder about it, because I didn't realize what I had to do for 3 billion. Normally, I wouldn't have turned down such a sum for anything, but we mustn't forget that I am a unique case, even among the awakened, and no one has ever heard of a hunter increasing his level and becoming stronger. And if that happens, the 3 billion is nothing. But I had my own conditions, which Jinho had to accept. I said it was just the two of us, and no one else at that moment. Jinho got nervous, because if he's not wrong, I want us to clean up the dungeon alone. From the rank, everything was right. I told him that he got it right, but Jinho replied to me that only a group of 10 people could enter the dungeon. I told him that people would line up for the chance to get money just by being a crowd, and we'd use Huang Dongsu's method. Jinho started to get nervous. It was dangerous for him to drink. But I realized that he couldn't handle two. In other words, if we can handle it, no one gets hurt. He just needs to think about it. After all, let's say we successfully completed 19 raids as part of our group. We'll be the group that successfully completed 19 raids. And wouldn't that look impressive in his father's eyes? And now, finally, Jinho understands, and that's what we're going to do from now on. But Jinho will have to recruit more men immediately. As I ran, I remembered this conversation with Jinho. But suddenly I realized that I had completed my daily task, and it was complete. I stopped and realized that I had gone a little overboard. After all, I had run 11 kilometers instead of 10. When I had already turned around, I thought my sister was running behind me, but she wasn't there. I started thinking about why the quest was counting even after I had completed the quest, and I decided that I needed to wait for my sister anyway. So why don't I still do the workout? And after 20 minutes, I exceeded all of my daily tasks and realized that after 200 times I could no longer do squats, push-ups, and abs. And it's the same with running. I realized I can't run 200k, so I'll start with 20 for now, but suddenly my sister was behind me. She was so tired when she got to me. As soon as she stopped to talk to me, I started running even harder at this point and ended up running farther and farther away from her. At this time in Washington, D.C., a man was on the phone to be sent information on these two survivors. And at this point the girl came into the room and asked Mr. Huang what he was doing so late. But Mr. Huang asked this girl Lola if he could ask her something, and she said anything. Mr. Huang asked what the consequences would be if he killed someone. He checked with Lola's girlfriend to see if he was serious or if he was joking, given that Korea had not yet signed the Indian Hunters Crime Pact. Since you are a hunter from America, you will be tried in America, and the case will probably be easily hushed up. To this answer Mr. Huang was pleased. And when he turned around, he was terribly angry. After all, some brats had killed his brother, and if he didn't crush them with his hands, he wouldn't be able to sleep in peace. It was S-rank hunter Huang Dongsu of the Cleaners Guild. He began to reflect that 7 of his brother's men were dead and 2 of some boys survived. And the survivors were D and E ranks, and his brother was not the kind of man who would risk his life for weaklings. Also, they were only porters, not fighters, and they must not have trapped and killed him. And that's why he told him he couldn't do anything without me. Mr. Huang began to tell the girl that he needed to visit Korea for a while, and she in turn should clear out for him, to which the girl replied that if he disappeared so suddenly, the guild would be paralyzed. I asked the girl when he would have some free time, and she said in about 2 weeks. However, Mr. Huang stated that 2 weeks is not enough time even for a decent funeral. He would have an opportunity for revenge, but the girl Lola asked, "Will it be alright?" He was more than sure of that. He hoped that the 2 scoundrels would still be alive in 2 weeks. And the 2 guys in question were Hunter D rank Jinho and Hunter E rank Sun Jinwoo. At the time, I was outside in the late afternoon, standing outside the building with my blade in hand and holding the dungeon key. I realized that when I fulfilled the conditions of the quest, a hidden quest opened up. This key allows me to enter the dungeon of the Demon Castle and can only be used in Songgu Tower. I certainly expected to get a better than usual reward, but I didn't think I would get an S-grade item. I realized that the hidden quest is only given out if you exceed the daily quests, and for me that's a good chance since I picked the shiny random box and couldn't take the cursed one. Anyway, I got the key to the dungeon and now I just have to enter it. When I went through the portal, I came out on the other side, where there was fire everywhere. I realized that if the class matched the difficulty of the dungeon, it was an S-rank dungeon, and the chance of my survival must be 0. And of course, there is no proof that my assumption is correct, but on the other hand, the dungeon I created earlier corresponded to a gate to a dungeon of rank E. So, what am I going to do if the key class matches the dungeon difficulty? I still have the return stone. If it gets too hot, I'll just use it and all I have to do is put my best foot forward. There's no future dungeon sweeping with Jinho's rank. So I just have to find out the limits of my strength. If I back down because I'm afraid, I'll never get stronger. At that moment, a monster approached me, and he was already beside me. It was a 3-headed strange dragon dog. His name was the Guardian of the Gates of Hellserber. I knew, looking at him, that I would become much stronger, for I could not die. Instead, I would raise my level even higher. I can't die in a place like this. Yes, and the key that allows you to enter the demonic castle is a Class S item. If the rarity of the key matches the difficulty of the dungeon, then the chances of my survival tend to 0, and the best choice would be to level up as high as I can, and return when I get stronger. Once I reach rank B, the difficulty of the dungeon begins to increase exponentially, which is fortunate. The higher the level of the dungeon, the lower the chance of that level gate, and the number of existing S-grade dungeon enemies. Even if S-ranked hunters assemble in teams, this does not guarantee that they will be able to clear this type of dungeon. Only such gates were found on Jeju Island, and after the gate was breached, the terrain there turned into a scorched wasteland, uninhabitable. The current hunter situation does not allow me to effectively defend all S-ranked dungeons, and with my current level I had to refrain from visiting S-ranked dungeons. The threat of so many S-rank monsters is incomparable, their incredible toughness and crushing power. I jumped from my seat and started fighting this monster, and then a thought occurred to me, would my attacks have any effect on a monster of this level? It made me simply curious. Suddenly I saw a notification from the system informing me that my Wolf Killer title and sprint skill had been activated. My movement speed had increased by 30%, but now I had to spend 1 mana unit per minute. I approached the monster and began to deal more and more damage to it. In response to my attack, the monster roared loudly. I continued to hit it, and at one point activated my ability, Bloodlust. But at that moment my effect was cancelled, because my opponent's resistance was too high. This monster began to go into a rage, as a result of which the whole atmosphere around us changed. And then I realized that it didn't work. It wasn't a bad opportunity to test my abilities, but we never used it, and the difference in power was too great. Even despite the effect of my... And then I realized that this was, without a doubt, a rank S dungeon. At this point Cerberus, the Guardian of Hell's Gate, began to use the Wrath skill, and it will be active for 3 minutes. At this point, Cerberus' characteristics will be doubled. Cerberus started to run straight at me, but I noticed that the system was indicating the difference in our strength. And when I was able to hit him in the head with my blade, I was notified that the system was telling me that Cerberus felt no pain and my attacks just couldn't reach his pain threshold. I thought I was going to get it right, but really I needed to think 10 more times before heading into this dungeon. Now, however, I can't just stop. I hesitated for a second, and one of Cerberus' heads came right at me. Before I could dodge it, it bit into my shoulder with its big fangs. It made me uncomfortable, and I felt a terrible pain. In an instant, it threw me to the ground. I lay there not knowing what would happen next. Would I survive? As I lay in the ground, rocks protruding from my sternum, I began to get continuous notifications that my health was rapidly dwindling. Eventually a notification appeared that my health had dropped below 30%, and the Fortitude ability was activated, which reduced the damage I was receiving by 50%. I realized that even in such a horrible situation, the system helps the player as much as possible to make sure he doesn't die. So it would be quite difficult for the perfect player to die. But I knew I could handle it, because it's different from a normal rebirth. If I became someone's plaything in the system, all I have to do is exceed the expectations of whoever is playing me. At one point there was a hack into the system, and I was awarded my first status recovery award. I successfully accepted it, and at the same moment a bright light illuminated us. I instantly grabbed Cerberus by the head with my hands and began to climb up. When I was on my feet, with a strong effort, I scrolled through the servers and tossed them aside. At the same moment, I jumped up with my blade in my hands and struck one of the heads, then immediately jumped over to the other and delivered a crushing blow. Cerberus fell to the ground. I hoped he wouldn't get up again after that. When I landed on the ground and saw the total chaos and destruction in front of me, I realized that I had managed to kill the Guardian of the Hellgate after all, and my level began to increase significantly. I stood beside Cerberus' body and thanked him, for thanks to him I realized my current level. If I opened that gate that had just appeared, I would simply die. I'll come back here when I'm much stronger and can go inside. In addition, as a reward, I'll be able to get an item, the Guardian's necklace, as well as the key to the castle gate and Cerberus's phone. But at this time late at night, in one of the buildings, 2 men met, and the guy in the stylish black suit began to say that he was the genius director of some business and some business he wanted to talk to me about. That older man started saying that he heard that everything that happened in the dungeon stays in the dungeon. But the other guy didn't understand what he was implying. Suddenly the old man threw a bag on the table and pointed it toward the man. He began to say that the bag contained 20 billion, and he thought the man understood what he was trying to say. He begged that hunter to take the case. This old man who held out the bag started shaking and begged the guy to kill those bastards. But in response, the old man heard the guy start saying that he would have to pay an extra 10 billion for all the other hunters. And if he can do that, we'll have a deal, because there's no problem for me to kill those insects he was talking about. But there will be other hunters with them. If you become a ranked hunter, you become a high-ranked hunter that the guild pays attention to. But you know why I wasn't tempted to join the Hunter Guild Oversight Division? The thing is, it's more interesting to me to kill people than monsters, said the guy in the black suit. A little later we see two guys practicing taekwondo. One of them is stepping on the other one, and the guy who has already taken off his sword and finished his training is watching. After they finished training, they took off their equipment, and one of the students told his master that he was in good shape, as always. But Mr. Sleepy turned around and asked him, "What are you talking about? After all, this old body will become useless if I stop training it." It was obvious that he had been restrained with me during training, and he was putting less energy into his thumb, taking care of it. But this guy wouldn't have done that if he still had two hands. But Mr. Sleep stopped that guy, because he's still talking about it, even months later. But suddenly Mr. Song got an important call. After all, hunters of no particular rank still get those annoying calls. So Mr. Song asked his partner to finish his training for the day. But the guy asked Mr. Song, is he really planning to postpone his retirement? But Mr. Song replied that even if he's alive for the long haul, whether or not he's retired, he wants to remain useful to this world. Mr. Song was surprised, for it amazed him that an S-rank hunter would learn the way of the sword from a soon-to-be novice like him. But that guy replied, all because even a high rank does not make up for a lack of skill. A little while later, Mr. Song was walking down the street, pondering that this time he would have to go into a dungeon of rank 2. And since his awakening had no effect on his power, he wondered why a swordsman like him had awakened as a hunter mage. After all, the sword skill he had been learning for the past decade could no longer be used in a dungeon, and there had to be a reason for that. But suddenly Mr. Song turned his attention to the guy standing beside him. When he apologized, I turned to him and saw that it was Mr. Song. He looked at me and was surprised, for he didn't recognize me at all, for there was no trace of the old me left. I had changed so much in just a few months. And he asked what had happened to me. And when he put his head down, he said he couldn't talk like that. Still, he wondered how I recovered my torn leg. But I started to explain that when I came to, it was already fine, and I'm not sure what really happened. Mr. Song didn't understand how that was possible, and it wouldn't have been good for a young man like you to be disabled. It was a great relief to him. Mr. Song began to tell me not to worry about it, because he was glad he could survive with my abilities. The word got back to him that I had survived, and I still couldn't believe it when I saw me with my own eyes. I started to ask him if he was still working under the guild's orders. He replied that yes, he did. Apparently, so are you. But when we turned around, we saw 3 silhouettes coming toward us. Mr. Song was surprised, for he had met some old acquaintances that day. Everyone who was there that day was back together again, and that healer girl named Juhi looked at me strangely, as if she had seen a ghost. But I noticed some guys beside her that I especially didn't want to see. It was Mr. Kim, and Mr. Song saw him and began to think that he had run away that day, leaving us behind. He must not have been happy to see us after he threatened me with his sword to use me as a victim. But even I left Jinwoo at the end, and at this point he has no right to judge them. He didn't think about it before, but now he sees that we all came back alive. Julie looked at me and started to say that I had changed so much, because she almost didn't recognize me. But I replied that I was a little late. But the fact that she was looking all over for me and didn't understand why now and why I had grown so much and my leg must be in bad shape. But when she saw my feet, she knew I was fine, and she didn't understand what was wrong. 12. But just as I started to answer, I heard words behind me that someone had started talking about a romantic atmosphere. And when we turned around, we saw the prisoners getting out of the car. They started saying that someone was shooting drama here or the hunters had decided to have a date tonight. But the guy, the last one to get out of the car, ordered them to shut up. 13. After all, this is no picnic, and we need to be more serious. But when one of the inmates walked by Jijo, he told her to take care of them today. We didn't understand what it was all about, but the manager came up to us and apologized for being late. She wanted to take care of the formalities first, but we were wondering what was going on here and why the prisoners were here. The girl began to answer that these people were in rehab, so they should join the hunters in this raid. But Mr. Sleepy was angry, because how can they go through rehab and also suggest that we go on a raid with criminals? But the girl replied that even though they are criminals and have been hunters in the past, it is not uncommon for hunters to commit crimes and serve time in dungeons to reduce their sentence. The girl started apologizing and told us to take note, because the number of hunters in the area has greatly diminished, so they have to resort to such measures. Also, the Department of Surveillance Hunter, TASIC, joined the raid. So we don't have to worry about that, because it takes about 10 hunters to handle the average rank hunter. At this point I knew something was wrong here, so I asked Mrs. Dewey, please don't enter this raid. She responded by asking, will I go? I replied, yes, and at that point she said she was going too, and we were all ready to go out on this raid. After a while, we began to approach the portal. Mr. Sohn was kind of uncomfortable, since we were probably all going together after all. Perhaps this is fate. We began to walk forward. After all, we were ready for all this. Mr. Sohn walked ahead as the leader of this group, just as he did when we went into that double dungeon. When they started to take the handcuffs off these criminals, they began to say, well, that's much better. One of the criminals turned around and asked who gave him permission to treat them as slaves. But in response he heard the jailer say, shut your mouth. Mr. Song asked me if I minded if he became the leader today. I said yes, but in response I saw him thank me for giving him another chance. He bowed his head and began to say that if it hadn't been his fault, 11 people would have died, and because of me 6 survived. He was responsible for failing to protect them, and he thanked me on behalf of all the hunters. But I asked him to raise his head, because everyone was already paying attention. When Mr. Song looked up, he asked Mr. Kim if he would mind if he led today's raid. But Mr. Kim turned around and started into the dungeon, telling him to do what he wanted. After a while, when we were already inside, the goblins started attacking us. There were a lot of them, but the jailers deftly handled them. One of them beat a goblin with a whip, while a second killed and cut them in half with a large stick. The third, using his bare hands, beat all the goblins that were near him. He destroyed one of the goblins with one punch, but we looked at them and didn't understand which one was the monster and which one was human. But Mr. Song was looking so intently at the jailers that he didn't notice that there was a goblin behind him. He managed to react, however, and turned around and hit him with his fire magic. He deftly used his skills, and any goblins that approached him were instantly destroyed by the infernal flames. Mr. Kim looked at Song and saw that this man had incredible strength. However, Mr. Song turned around and asked Mr. Kim, is it normal for a swordsman to have such a weak swing? Our leader started talking to get us to be more positive. After all the survivors of that incident are back together, and when he turned his attention to me, he said that he thought I had gotten stronger, and asked where I had found such a good dagger. After all, it is strange to see a normally unarmed Song using a dagger, and Jihu also turned her attention to me and said that she had never had to heal me until now, and asked if I was sure that I had not practiced martial arts lately. But I replied that I was just doing my exercises every day. Mr. Song began to reflect on what he had said, and it was no joke. After all, I did look very different from the Jin Woo we used to know. He looked at me and saw that not only my appearance but also my aura had changed. After all, I had always thought I was hopeless, but now I was very much even in myself, and I was finally a man. Juhi, on the other hand, seems frightened. She is still afraid of goblins, her trauma must be deep, and unfortunately, at this rate she will have to quit. But at this time we saw that there were 3 tunnels in front of us, and the overseer began to tell us that the dungeon was relatively easy and suggested that we split up. However, the danger would increase and the passage time would be greatly reduced. The warden said that he would watch the prisoners and go the right way. If we happen to find the boss room, we can call them, but I saw with my own eyes the aura coming from the left tunnel and asked the leader to take the left path. At that moment, however, I saw the face of that overseer, and something about him didn't please me. When we finally split up, I realized that the boss is at the end of this path, and with goblins I get almost no experience. I need to kill the boss, too, to get anything at all. What's more, the good thing about this guy is that he went along with the prisoners, and I won't see him again. 11. As our paths diverged, the warden went into one of the corridors with the outlaw. He asked the outlaws if they could take care of the goblins, to which they replied that the goblins were weak and simple, and had no chance against them. In fact, however, goblins are usually weaker than adults, and their size and intelligence are comparable to children. Nevertheless, they are pesky creatures who can swarm near a target and attack with support. Of course, even if you give guns to human children, they will be just as pesky, because a child with a gun can kill someone. And frankly, there are plenty of child soldiers who are armed and attacking people on the other side of the earth. There is no difference between humans and monsters here, both are insects, was what the warden told the criminals. He asked them if they could convince the children. But they said, "What kind of a stupid question is that?" But the jailer kept saying that they would meet hundreds of children in that dungeon. From that moment on, they did not understand what he was talking about or why there should be children in the dungeon. The warden began to say that they did. The bottom line is that they are willing to kill anybody to survive. And so he would say to the Hunters Guild, "Guys, we ran into hundreds of goblins here. But in the meantime, the other group, where Mr. Kim and the other guy were dealing with all the goblins and realized that if they were so easy, they could handle them. It would have been nice if the raid had ended without incident." Mr. Kim suspected something would happen. After all, if I'm weaker than the hunter, then the dungeon is weak, too. He remembered that it wasn't, and then they said, in that double dungeon. But it wasn't like that at all, and Mr. Kim decided that after that he would also bow to Mr. Jin Woo to apologize. Mr. Kim asked the guy if he felt guilty, too. After all, they both did. Then they ran away, because they are what they are called hunters, and they can't act like they normally do. But after they left allies in trouble, if we're going to continue to be hunters, we have to get used to something like a little bowing. Mr. Kim doesn't know if he can get forgiveness, though. Even if he won't forgive us, I have to apologize, he said. But that guy started saying we don't have time now and we have to keep going. And since there are two of us, we have to be careful. And it looked like those who went the other directions weren't done yet. But suddenly Mr. Kim came around the corner, and what he saw horrified him. The warden began to say to the prisoner, "Our lovelies, we've had enough of you ourselves, and our job is to kill you as painfully as possible. I guess I was done with them too quickly, but it was fun to watch you call for help. And your bodies are lying under my feet, but there's nothing I can do about that anymore, because I was told to kill you fast." And at that moment Mr. Kim and his partner came out from around the corner, and he was horrified by what he saw. The warden had killed two prisoners, and he had the third by the throat and was about to deal with him in the same way himself. When the warden saw your hunters looking at him, he didn't understand where they were coming from. And that means that the way to the boss's room is on the left. Now you won't have to walk around aimlessly, and his schedule has changed a bit. At that moment I heard a scream coming from the other end of the hallway, and I immediately felt a thirst for blood. I asked Mr. Song to hurry back, and we started running back. When we ran into the next corridor at the end of the tunnel, I saw the warden, lurking in an ambush, tried to kill Jinhu, but I managed to react and stopped his blow. At this point it became clear to him that I was as fast as he was. I asked him why he was doing this and why he wanted to kill us. The warden was shocked that I was able to block his ambush. The warden bounced back at this point and didn't understand how I got such power. After all, I had actually stopped his attack, and the warden realized that I had a heightened sense. The overlord began to say that even if it hadn't been in my plans to fight everyone else, it seemed that the healer would still have been a nuisance. So I tried to eliminate her first. But it looks like I'm going to have to change my plan. I'm going to kill you all right here. When Mr. Song started yelling at him to stop and asked why the guild member was doing that, I turned around. But what I saw behind me made me not believe my eyes. He who is only 1 in 1,000 awakened, and only 1 in 5,000 awakened, is a Diranga or higher. The responsibility for many lives rests on our shoulders, 1 in 5,000. Although I am a hunter, I am also a husband and the father of my children. So I cannot die today, and I cannot die tomorrow. Mr. Kim, covered in blood because he was cut by that warden, sat up, but I looked at him and could not imagine such an outcome. It's a raid. I saw him sitting on the ground bleeding. I asked Mrs. Jui to hurry up and fix him quickly. She ran up to him and started to heal him, but I heard back from her that we couldn't save him, because it was too late. She needs to stop wasting her strength, for he has already lost too much blood. But I started yelling at him that he had to live, because he said he had to live for his family. He must live, no matter what, so I could hate him. But in response I heard him tell me that he was sorry and he didn't want to apologize. That's how he wanted to apologize in his head. But if he put his head down now, he would just die. After all, Mr. Kim did let out his last breath and put his head down for good. The last thing I heard from him was him telling me that he was really sorry it had happened that way. And after that I never heard from him again, for he was sitting there covered in blood, nailed to the wall, exhausted and wounded. I started to ask the other warden, why did he do that to Mr. Kim? But the answer I heard was that the warden said he didn't know, because it could have been monsters. And then one day the gates opened and the monsters burst out. It was like a natural disaster. Now he came up with a great story. It was originally supposed to be the story of a massacre by goblins, but it seems like he has to change it a little bit. Got out and tried to escape, and after they killed all of you, they tried to attack me while I was fighting the boss. But their strength was clearly not enough to kill a hunter of rank, and in the end the only survivor of this raid was me. The warden asked us if we thought the people outside would believe such a story, but I thought he was just a piece of shit, at which point Mr. Song told me to stop, because he wasn't the kind of man I could handle. I should leave it to him. Mr. Song understood that he was in rank, and a hunter like me from rank wouldn't be able to hurt him. Besides, he's an assassin class hunter, and I would lose him in speed, but Mr. Song picked up the sword that lay near his feet, and realized that perhaps the Overlord had a weak defense, and who knows what would happen if I managed to get his spells. After all, it had been a long time since I'd fought against a human. At this point Mr. Song asked Miss Jui if she could cast a physical strength enhancing spell on him. And she agreed. At the same moment, she applied her skill to Mr. Song so that he could not return. When the BAF went into effect, Mr. Song was already ready to act. The warden looked at all this and asked what he was going to do. After all, he is an ordinary mage, and the buff that increases physical strength is really quite useless to mages. But now, Mr. Sun was willing to do all this for the sake of revenge and to protect all those who were near him. He won't do it the same way he did last time, and he won't just run away from this dungeon, because he is a swordsman, not an ordinary mage. And since I am a mage, I need to be wary of the differences in strength, stamina, and dexterity between us. Even if I'm protected by Miss Jui, it's like putting a car engine on a bicycle and pedaling as hard as I can. It's like a steep descent. If I can't control my speed and I drift, I'll probably die. While I was thinking about my plans, the warden had already attacked me and was ready to destroy me at that second. The Overlord didn't consider it normal for a mage to be defenseless against an assassin, and it was a good idea to bring a weapon with him. But he's only a mage, and his physical strength didn't even reach D rank. What difference would the fact that he brought a weapon make? But after these words from the warden, Mr. Song engaged him, and I saw how Mr. Song was instantly able to hit him as if to cut him in half. Mr. Song had pretty good moves, and he was also strong thanks to the healer buff. Besides, Mr. Song had practiced a lot of sword fighting, but he still lacked the speed to catch up with that guy. I noticed how Song was able to catch up to the Overlord for a second, but it was still an obvious difference in class. They continued to fight, but Mr. Song wasn't getting anywhere, because his sword wasn't keeping up with that guy's speed. The Overlord began to smile suspiciously, because he noticed that his opponent's attacks were so fast and accurate, and that's pretty cool. It was a good idea to give up the magic and take up arms. Still, Mr. Song miscalculated a bit, and the warden was able to wound him. After that, the warder began to say that if he thought a little, he would understand why there were no mage swordsmen among the mass of hunters. But suddenly he saw the healer begin to heal him, and the wound he had inflicted disappeared instantly. The healer became a real headache for the Overlord, and the Overlord decided that he could not let this battle drag on. The warden decided to finish off the healer at the first opportunity, for to him he was now the source of many problems. But at that very moment, Mr. Song began to act, for it was not a good idea to put the swordsman's back to him in combat. A second more and Mr. Song would have finished off the Overlord, but he managed to turn around and parry his blow. Mr. Song was no ordinary old man, and the jailer understood that already. After all, you can't tell about Mr. Song, but he has an apprentice who is of rank S. If his body isn't strong enough, his skills make up for it. But the warden didn't think so, and unfortunately, there are always limits to a given strength. Let's face it, an offensive mage cannot keep up with the speed of an assassin. The Overlord began to move even faster, and with his speed and skill with his blades, he was able to inflict many wounds on Mr. Song, causing him to start bleeding. the healer did not have time to heal everything. If it had been anyone else, Mr. Song would have had a chance to win, but the warden's rank outnumbered him several times over. I was with Jin Ho and watched the battle. And when we saw Mr. Song bow his head after his wounds, we knew that he realized it was all useless. After all, the warder was already standing beside him, ready to kill him painlessly. But Mr. Song had planned all this in advance and was not ready to give up so easily. He put his hand on the ground and was able to use his fire magic. The Overlord found himself in a ring of fire. Mr. Song hoped it would work, but it wasn't that simple, for the warden was already behind him and began to say that he was a mage pretending to be a swordsman to hide his magical abilities. And unleashing all his magical power at the right moment is not a bad plan, you sly old fox, but that would be the end of it. And Mr. Song was already ready to say goodbye to his life, as the warden had already raised his hand and was ready to deliver the final blow. But suddenly I decided to intervene, because I couldn't just stand by and watch my friend die in front of me. I blocked his blow, causing his arm and the dagger to fly away. The warden was shocked at where I had come from and didn't understand how I had been able to block his blow. The warden began to ask me who I was and what my rank was, and I told him that my name was Sun Jinwoo and I was Irang. After that, the warden bounced back and couldn't believe his ears. After all, there was no way that someone who could fend off his attacks and be as fast as him was just an Irang. At this time, Mr. Song was able to get to his feet and did not understand how I managed to do it, but the warden was surprised and began to tell me that if I was a power type, then releasing such power would have been possible even for an Irang. However, looking at my speed and reaction time, it wasn't that easy. After all, I was able to block his attacks twice, and it turns out that my class is an assassin. Not only that, but it looks like I was hiding my true power, doesn't it? And even if you're a false ranger, you're not, because your friends seem to have known you for a long time. And that's impossible, because a pseudo-ranger wouldn't allow someone who sought his real power to survive. And there is only one answer here: you are an over-awakened one. After these words, Warden Jin Face and Mr. Song were surprised, for they had no idea that Sun Jinwoo had been reawakened. The overseer went on to say that judging by my friend's reactions, you had recently awakened, and come to think of it, my guild boss had recently checked on someone because he thought he had awakened, and I think it was you. Anyway, it looks like you're an inexperienced hunter, in which case the warden should teach me a lesson. When the warden finished talking and threatening me, I decided to ask him why he did all this. And it wasn't just about the prisoners, because maybe they deserved all this. But why did you kill all the other hunters? The warden looked at me and saw that I was angry beyond belief. My face became very frightened, which made him smile strangely. And I say that, to be honest, he only did it for fun. And a little bit earlier, the old man who had offered the warden the job had told him that night that he'd heard that whatever happens in the dungeon stays there, and nobody else knows about it. Then he gave him a big bag with a lot of money in it for the work to be done. The old man began to plead with the jailers that he should kill all those responsible for the horrible crime. But the warden began to say that to do this he would have to pay an additional 10 billion for all the other criminals. If the old man could do it, the deal would go through. However, the jailer wondered why he would want to do this. But the old man began to say, when you go outside and see trash, you feel uncomfortable, but you don't clean it up. The warden didn't understand why he had to do all this. But the old man began to say that one of the inmates had harmed his daughter, causing her to take her own life, and her mother was still in the hospital from shock. I think about how the animals would walk free. Only a few years after the incident, he still can't sleep at night because of his actions. Eventually, the warden said he understood and was willing to provide a service worthy of 30 billion won. So the old man doesn't have to worry about it. Eventually, the warden began to explain to me that he just couldn't say no to the father whose daughter had been beaten by these criminals, and he tried to get him to change his mind by raising the price. But he accepted it anyway. Even though it turned out that way, the warden didn't want to hurt all the other guys. If they agreed not to talk about today's incident, he'd let them go. But I didn't think he would say that. But from the look on his face, he still wants to teach us a lesson and show us who's the best here. After all, I didn't believe him from the beginning, and there's no reason to trust someone who recently made up a story about our deaths. The moment the warden began to approach me, we got into a fight. I was able to parry his blow, and when he was next to me, he started saying that whether I believed me or not didn't matter anymore. He would be sorry that all of you would have to die with these insects, but I told him that he was too damn pathetic. At first the warden didn't understand what I was telling him, but right after that I told him that he was definitely going to die today. After I said that, the warden started smiling strangely, and he didn't know how high rank I had gotten since I was E rank. But now I shouldn't think it would be so easy. And so we began the battle, and when I swung, he walked away from my strike. It was like he evaporated. I looked at him and all I could see was his head flickering around me. I thought I could finish him off with one punch, but it turned out he was pretty fast. I underestimated him, and Mr. Song was watching us, and his eyes couldn't keep up with our speed. He couldn't understand how we could move at that speed. Mr. Sleep looked at me and realized that I wasn't the same guy I used to be, not the guy he'd known a month ago. At the same time I was fighting with this warden, and during the battle he started telling me that 30 billion won wouldn't be enough for a job like this. And who would have thought that I would meet a hunter of that level here? After all, we have the same speed. The wardens began. They asked me what my speed limit was, and even if my eyes could follow me, it was useless if your body couldn't handle it. But at that point Mrs. G put a speed boost on me, and I was able to move even faster. And at that moment the warden realized that the game seemed to be over, and we had to get serious. 12. We started fighting even harder, and everything in that cave was flying in different directions because we were moving so fast. My friends were standing behind us. Even though they knew we were fighting equally, they couldn't even keep up with our speed. They just watched as the pile of stones and dust rose in the air, and the sounds of our blades were heard throughout the cave. Mr. Song and Mrs. G had never seen such a battle before, as if two monsters had begun to destroy everything near them. During the battle, the overseer began to say that even if we had the same speed and ability, and the difference in experience was too great, the difference would lead to my defeat. If I am going to defend my healer, I have to do it right. At that moment, he launched one of his blades directly at the healer. I turned around and realized that I wouldn't have time to move in time to protect her. But at that moment, Mr. Song got in front of the healer and was able to fight that blade off with his ball. I breathed a sigh of relief, for nothing threatened the healer. At that very moment, however, the healer began to attack me with all his might. He was cutting me with his knees, but I adopted a blocker pose and thought he could not inflict serious wounds on me. Although there were wounds, they were non-critical, and I was still on my feet. When the warden stopped attacking me, were surprised that I was quite resilient. I stood in the same spot and began to feel my bloodlust begin to break through. She was sensitive to the urge to kill, and I got an emergency assignment from the system again, because my system was activated again because of it. The purpose of the assignment was to kill the players who intended to kill me to ensure my safety. If the assignment was not completed, my heart would stop. And now I realized that I had no choice but to kill that overseer. For if I didn't, I risked losing my life. I was ready to act and go right at him. The warden noticed that I looked different already, but he still thought the advantage was on his side. I was grateful that the system was giving me another reason to finish this guy off, and at that moment I shifted and started attacking the overlord with speed. We skirmished in combat, but the warden began to tell me that my class, which specializes in daggers and agility, kills mostly in close combat. Am I not a better opponent for you? He asked me, but I thought differently. And here's the fact that I certainly learned a lot from him, including the fact that a guy talking gives away such uselessness. And at the same moment I activated my sprint skill and my movement speed increased by 30% and my mana consumption decreased to 1 unit every minute. I was much faster than before. And at that very moment, the warden became nervous, because he hadn't expected this turn of events. And when I was able to pass the state defense, he was stunned, because he realized that I was also using my skills. Eventually, I was able to hit the warden and gave him a scratch with my dagger. At the same moment, the warder began to feel terrible pain on his face, as my paralysis effect had been activated. I also activated the bleeding effect. From now on, he will lose 1% of his health per second. The warden stammered as he realized that it was poison acting directly on him. But after a moment he realized that my dagger was poisoned, and I could cast effects with the poison I had learned to use in my dagger. However, the warden was not such an easy opponent, and he began to resist my effect because of his high resistance. My effect was cancelled at the same moment, and I looked at him with surprise, because my action stops quickly if my opponent is strong. The overseer also began to show me that she had something interesting in mind. I watched to see what he wanted to show me, and I saw the warden begin to disappear from where he was standing. And after an update, he completely disappeared. That's what I didn't expect. I couldn't figure out what had happened. It was as if he had evaporated before my eyes. But suddenly I felt someone want to hit me. I was able to block his blow with my intuition. And at that same moment, I began to hear a voice beside me begin to tell me that I had indeed blocked it. So even though he was hiding his presence, and considering that you have great instincts, that deserves praise, the Overlord was able to erase his appearance, his scent, his sound, and even his aura, and only a few will be able to kill using this rare skill. At first it was said that no one yet knew that he had this ability, but there are those who have seen him use it. No one yet has survived. Suddenly I felt a pain in my legs, and when I put my head down, I saw blood starting to flow from my legs. I knew at once that he, being invisible, had managed to cut my tendons in my legs. My wounds could be healed quickly, but only basic healing spells work at this distance. And when the healer wanted to help me, the warden appeared and pointed his blade at her, saying, "Don't try anything, I'll come for you when it's your turn, Mr. Song." I realized that if nothing was done, there would be no endurance left of Mr. Jinwoo, and he could not call for help now, help me with his skills, but must buy some time for his healing. At the same moment it appeared that I would not be able to stand up to him in this state, and at least my speed would definitely not be the same as before. After all, it would take a long time to heal such wounds. But I told him to shut his mouth, for he talks too much. Yes, this battle was getting to me completely fed up, and at this point I decided that it was time to call it a day. I activated my status recovery skill, and at that moment I began to heal all my wounds. Mr. Song and Mrs. Jinho couldn't believe their eyes, and neither could the warden. After all, I was instantly healed. The warden couldn't understand and began to think that maybe he wasn't a killer hunter, because everything looked like cheating. You can't be sure that a hunter with the recovery ability even exists. But I, for my part, realized that because of certain limitations, it didn't make sense to rely on that alone. Come to think of it, there are other options. But the warden thought it was a trick, or perhaps a feigned confidence, and he wondered how many times I could use this ability. It was hard for him to tell, but to him I was very dangerous at this point. But I have full confidence in myself now. I realized again that one of my senses was dead in me, and the likes of him were not even worthy of my wrath. After all, I stand several stories above him in strength, agility, and speed. And so I began to act. I approached the warden directly and swung, but I didn't hit him. Although I was very close, the warden immediately realized that I saw him again through the camouflage, and I aimed straight at his neck without any hesitation. It was all clear to the warden now, for he had finally seen the real difference between me and him. The warden guessed that I had committed murders before, and you and I weren't so different. There are many ways to live and die, and his determination to change his fate, even at the cost of his life, eventually forced him to make hard decisions quickly. The changes of the past 2 months were not only external, for it was the awakening and an unexpected force that changed the rules of society. New exclusive rules have been created just for hunters, and there is no need to be constrained by law or morality, for the words of the strong are law. At that moment, the Overlord decided to show me his true power and lunged at me, but I was ready for it and stayed where I was. He started attacking me from all sides, but I stood and parried. The warden seemed to understand how I saw him through the camouflage. When the camouflage is activated, it hides his presence. But when he attacks with a strong lust for killing, for a moment his presence is revealed. That's exactly what he's waiting for, and he has no other way of knowing where I'm attacking from. And he must stop it. Such thoughts were the only ones that visited the warden. I didn't care what that warden thought or guessed, for my killing lust skill had been activated. The Overlord had fallen into my trap, and now he wasn't going anywhere. For my trap had already worked, and my terrible shadow was already consuming him, and he didn't realize what was happening. But when he lifted his head, he saw something ominous in front of him, staring straight into his soul. It was my darkness that clouded his eyes. My shadow began to recede little by little, and now the warden no longer knew what to do or how to get out of this terrifying trap. I decided to deliver one last, controlling blow right into his heart, and my dagger plunged into him. He, in turn, didn't even realize what had happened, but I was already standing in front of him, ready for the next step. He who fights with monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself. And if you look long into the abyss also looks into you. For in the course of his life, the hunter witnesses countless deaths and takes his own life. Often there are situations in which the hunter finds himself between life and death, and in such moments he fights not only against monsters, but also against other hunters. We become the perfect killing machines, but you, as an ordinary person, do not fall into that category. I'm going to die because I lost, and that's natural. The warden decided to ask me only one question: who am I really? An assassin with recovery magic and skills that impose a negative effect. After all, he'd never heard of anything like that, but I wasn't entirely sure myself, either. The warden went on to say that although his words meant nothing to me, having a bunch of secrets wasn't so great. At this point, my paralysis effect activated, as well as the bleeding effect. The overlord began to bleed even more, his body no longer listening to him. After I killed him, I could no longer hide my abilities, but I began to tell him that let's pretend I was a hunter, getting stronger with every battle, and how strong he thought I could become. The overseer began to smile and said that my shadow was merging with the darkness, and I would become as strong as my shadow would sink into the darkness. At this point, the task was completed, and I was able to complete the emergency task by killing the enemy. As a reward, I was asked to choose one of the rewards shown. Although I stopped much stronger than before, for the same reason I can feel something change in me. As I get stronger, at this point my thoughts were interrupted by Jean Ho, who was standing behind me. She thanked me for saving her. After all, thanks to me, they would be dead by now if I hadn't been here. But now we have to decide what to do next, and I guess we should go out and tell the guilds what happened. That's what Mr. Song told me. I told him that we should close the dungeon first, but Mr. Song asked me, "Aren't you going to go out and kill the boss by yourself?" Even though he saw my skills, he won't try to stop me this time. After all, he wants to bury his friends properly now. I walked over to the warden to retrieve my blade, and suddenly a notification appeared in front of me that I had received a new invisibility rune. And then I realized that I could get his ability by killing him. Mr. Song began to say that he and Jiho Monthly would go first and inform the guild, but I had to hurry. After all, they will be waiting for me outside. I replied to tell them not to worry, for it wouldn't take long. And when they had gone, I went over to those prisoners who were lying on the ground and began to say, "I know he is alive, and you will have to get up." I began to question the prisoner about why he was trying to pretend to be dead and about his attempt to escape unnoticed. However, when he was lifted up, I noticed that his throat had been cut and he could not speak. It was pretty brutal, since his vocal cords had been cut. He was probably going to kill his victims in the most excruciating way possible after they were unable to scream. He was dying of blood loss, but if we ask Miss Gihu, he could probably survive. The prisoner thought he was saved, but I began to pull him in the other direction. However, as soon as the prisoner realized that this was not the way out, he began twitching in different directions. Soon we came to the door, which was the entrance to the boss's room. The prisoner's eyes bulged when he saw that it was the boss's room, and there was a mighty, huge man standing in front of him. I started asking the prisoner questions because I wanted to know if he remembered the faces of all his victims. I knew he was as trash as the warden, and whether he thought I would let a monster like him out. Immediately after my words, all the goblins behind him began to pounce on him and tear him to pieces with their big, green paws. They pounced on him like a herd of horrible monsters, for monsters know nothing else but to pounce on their prey in a group and tear it to pieces. Silent cries spread everywhere after that. You were able to defeat the boss and defeat the goblin right after that. It wasn't that hard for me, and after leaving the dungeon, Mr. Song and Miss Jui explained to the guild employee what had happened. The employee truly realized the magnitude of what had happened and rushed to contact his superiors. It didn't take long for the elite to arrive, and soon after, they drove over and unhitched all the buildings near us. As soon as they got out of the car, the two guys started asking questions. "How long has it been since we left the dungeon?" one of them asked. The girl replied that it had been about 40 minutes and only 20 minutes left. "It's been too long, and all the employees who were here need to try to save the bodies of the victims in 8 minutes. If that doesn't work, someone needs to leave them there and come back." The guy continued to ask questions. Did those survivors clean up the dungeon themselves? The girl confirmed that they did. Then the guy who arrived realized that the warden had tried to kill the other hunters while performing a contract killing. If this was true, then he had deliberately arranged the corpses and closed the dungeon because he had something to hide. But suddenly this guy saw me, and he was surprised. He realized that he was the hunter's son Jin Woo. At first he didn't recognize me. He asked me, "Finally we meet again." I realized he was one of the supervisory officers. The guy introduced himself and said his name was Jean Shul and he was the head of the oversight department. He seemed to think that one of his employees had inconvenienced us, and they would give us their unofficial apology after the case was solved and the investigating committee would handle the case in their place. And then I realized that there was no time to relax, just because I had killed a hunter, and even though I hadn't noticed it before. Well, looking at the head of supervision, I realized that he is strong and on a completely different level, and I can't handle him at my current strength. However, the head of oversight began to say that as a member of the oversight department he had some questions he wanted to ask us and things would go smoothly if we cooperated with them. I replied that I understood, and he decided to ask us directly, who killed the high-ranking overseer? After these words, I thought to myself that it seemed impossible to hide the fact that I was overworked now, and I would probably have to terminate my contract with Jinho. And since he wanted a talented but not yet too experienced hunter, all would be lost. But suddenly Mr. Song answered the supervisor's question and said that it was he who killed the supervisor alone. The head then asked if he didn't mind, he should name his rank. Mr. Song said that he was of rank 0. The head did not understand how from rank 0 he could defeat a high-ranked hunter, but Mr. Song began to say that he could not see who was behind him. The chapter saw that with the healer's support and rank, they were probably able to defeat him. But the overseer was one of those who could not be controlled even within the department. Could he, with his one-armed rank, truly defeat a dangerous assassin in battle? He asked to go through them with him, for he was afraid he would need our help in filing a few reports. But a little later I stepped back with Mr. Song and asked him why he lied. He replied that he had just assumed that I had a good reason for hiding my abilities and that I shouldn't have done it. Yes, and I can't avoid an investigation anyway, and Mr. Song can't pay me for everything I've done for him. But right now that's all he can offer me. After that, the head began to ask me that he didn't think he could be overpowered by a hunter like me before, like the warden. And he also thinks that there is no reason to suspect me of overshadowing again. However, he decided to tell me something that he advised me to be more careful in the future, otherwise my life might soon be cut short. But I didn't understand what that meant. But the head went on to say that when Huang Dong-suk's group was destroyed, only 2 people survived, me and another guy. And the problem is that Huang Dong-suk had a younger brother who could take revenge on us. And then I realized that he was talking about a hunter who was in S rank. And it doesn't matter what really happened in the raid. What matters is that I survived, and since he is in S rank, the law is unlikely to stop him. They are living wonders and a disaster at the same time. And it's in my best interest to keep an eye on him, because we may be hunted by someone who even monsters fear. The head went on to say that if it were possible, my beloved and I could leave the country. That would not be a bad idea. However, 3 hours after the investigation into the warden's murder began, the general manager of the gold business turned himself in, confirming the investigation data. After that, Chun-hee asked me if I remembered the magic crystal I gave her in that double dungeon. That same evening we agreed to go for a walk, for we were just on our way home. I followed Jenny, and I noticed that she seemed uncomfortable being with me, and she began to ask me that I had changed a lot lately. But she hadn't changed a bit since then, even though she'd been through a lot. I told her that everyone changes in their own way, and though I was right, she began to say that I should know that she was too buried to be a hunter. And she's trying to overcome her fears, but it's not easy. After all, if you're a healer of rank, it's okay to go on raids, either of rank or at least from rank, if you're ill-prepared. But it still only joins raids of D or E rank, and that's where she kept meeting me, continuing to heal wounds that wouldn't stop showing up on me. And, to be honest, it even began to annoy her, because she thought I was stupid and vain at times. I always managed to survive. Because I saw your eyes full of life, and they seemed to be screaming for survival and to see tomorrow. Junhee never thought she would ever have eyes like that. And I promised her that we would have lunch together when we came back alive. When she held out her hand to me, there was a magic crystal in it. She said she had to give it back to me. I noticed that she started talking about how she was going to leave and go back to her hometown of Busan. She said that if I was in that city, I should definitely call her and she would treat me to sushi. But I tried to hold back and not show too much enthusiasm. I held this magic crystal in my hand and told her that if I ever found myself in the neighborhood, I would ask her to walk with me again. She was very happy to hear this, and soon she waved me off and left. I stood alone that evening and wondered what I should do next, for I had just gained another reason to become stronger. After all, S-rank hunter Huang Dongsu is hunting me, and I need to become stronger as quickly as possible. That's the only way I can survive and fight back against anyone who tries to take my life. When I got home, I went to bed. The next morning I went to one of the places Jin-ho had told me to go. However, when I was already there, I didn't understand who all these people who had gathered here were. Jin-ho asked me what I meant. After all these people are our partners for the day, and those who have a hunter's license can't participate in raids for various reasons. They are injured or alcoholic. And then there are those who, for various reasons, continue to fight for life, and they have been assembled on our team. And there are also those who came here to make a quick buck. I wondered if even children were allowed into heaven. I asked Jin-ho, but he said that if it was a waking child, there was no law against them going. The girl who overheard our conversation heard what we said about her, and it was rude as she replied that she was a full-fledged hunter. I started asking her questions, since she was a high school girl, and asked if she had any experience in raids. She said no, but I told her it was okay, because they wouldn't have to follow us. They would just have to wait outside and only Jin-ho and I would go inside. Jin-ho started saying that we couldn't go into the dungeon just the two of us. That's why we took you guys with us. And the law requires at least 10 participants for the dungeon. Those guys who were standing there watching all of this were reflecting on the fact that we are really very strong. Since the two of us decided to go there, they were glad. And they were glad that we were really going to give them 3 million each, even if they stayed outside. Jin-ho started saying that 3 million for a raid to each of them was a hell of a deal, considering they wouldn't have to lift a finger, and all they had to do was wait outside for us until we were done. However, they must not tell anyone about what they see or hear here. If anyone blabbers, they have to pay 10 times what they make today. It's written in the contract they signed. But as soon as we started moving out, I saw something and started saying to Jin-ho, I was wondering, what the hell is he so degenerate about? But he started to answer, what is this? A complete set of hardened armor created in an Italian craftsman's jewel. If the two of us were going on a raid, shouldn't he have been fully prepared? But I decided to check something out, and when I approached him, I shoved him with one finger. And after that, like a big log, he fell to the ground, so he couldn't move in his suit. I decided to ask him to just take it off. When he tried to get up, it didn't work, so he asked me to help him. I set him down, and as he took off that stupid armor and helmet, he started talking. But because of his nervousness, he kept the stupid helmet to somehow secure his head. I mean, he took that helmet just in case, but it didn't matter to me anymore. And we just had to hurry up and get it over with. And just as we started going into the portal, those guys that were behind us started whispering amongst themselves that we were going into the dungeon alone. And what was even sillier was that we didn't look strong. One of those guys started saying that if he wasn't strong enough to defend the dungeon on his own, he wouldn't be better off mopping up a high-ranked dungeon with big monsters. And that if they even died, but we got our money's worth. And suddenly one of the guys started telling the other guys that he had once heard this name, Sun Jinwoo, and he was known as the world's weakest hunter, or rather, that was his nickname. And eventually these guys decided that we were just seeing each other, because youth bullying causes a lot of trouble for others. And a few hours later, Jin-ho ran out of the dungeon. Those guys waiting outside were surprised that he came back alive and thought he had just run away. But the other guy turned around and what he saw made him realize that it didn't look like Jin-ho had escaped. He told all the guys to turn around and look at it, because the gate was starting to close. And then they realized that we had killed the boss after all. When I got out, I asked Jin-ho, where do we go next? And Jin-ho replied that the next raid was about 1 o'clock away. Jin-ho started yelling to everyone else to get ready. After all, we're starting to move out, and we've got 3 more dungeons to clear today. Although those guys were shocked by what they saw, we figured they'd go, considering it's an easy 9 million for each of them. That high school girl who was standing behind us was surprised that we were going back to the dungeon after cleaning it up. She began to wonder who we really were. That same day at the White Tiger Guild, one of the guys brought a report and asked another to take a look at it. It said that 200,500,000 someone had actually spent that amount to get the rights to sweep the dungeon from the ranks. Recently there was a team, so now there are no gates left for hunters. It was originally 1,000, but even when they raised the price to 100 million, they bought back the rights for 200,500,000. This report made one of the guild staffers go into total shock. They began to read the report and saw that the leader of the group's name was Jin-ho, and they had never heard of him. They soon realized that he was the second son of Eugene's CEO, and it looks like they bought the rights with the support of the company. But after all, it's a big loss for them, and isn't that too risky an outing for a future CEO? But suddenly a memory came to one of the guys that they had heard of a survivor of that incident in the Double Den about 2 or 3 months earlier, and his name was Sun Jinwoo. It was already interesting, and that guy started screaming at everybody to drop what they were doing now. Hunter D ranked Jin Ho and E ranked Sun Jinwoo. Find whatever you can to take these two guys out now. At the White Tiger Guild, one of the guys started typing quickly on the keyboard and searching for information, and discovered that Sun Jinwoo had safely survived 3 accidents. The first mistake was the double murder. The second was the death of Hwang Dong-suk's group. The third was the recent murder of a supervising inspector. The two guys met during the second incident. The most interesting thing is how Jinho was connected to the Yojin company. Rumor has it that Chairman Mang Han is hiring experienced hunters and plans to start a guild. If this is true, it is not surprising that Jinho wants to profit from it. After all, recruiting experienced hunters and quickly clearing dungeons means that Jinwoo the hunter may wake up again. And of course, otherwise he wouldn't have had a chance of surviving those incidents. Each time it was a major incident with many victims, and there was no other explanation these guys saw in the last incident report. A mage with rank and a healer in rank worked together to stop the hunter watchman. But that was impossible, for he was a high-ranked assassin, and magic is almost useless against assassins. And he was clever, so the first thing he had to take care of was the target. In fact, it was supposed to be a mage versus assassin confrontation. Unless someone else defeated a hunter from the surveillance department, with the only survivors being the healer, the mage, and the hunter's son Jinwoo. And no one else. Among the survivors, only one person is suspicious, and now the White Tiger Guild must move out on a reconnaissance mission to find out for themselves, rather than seeking information from unreliable sources. One of my subordinates was shocked that the chief himself would go on a reconnaissance mission, although that is so rare. However, I was in the cave at the time, and there were 3 large wolfhounds in front of us. They were horrible monsters, but they weren't much of a threat to me. After all, I now had a very good skill with which I could disappear from sight. Because of this, those monsters began to shake with fear, because they felt the threat, but could not see it. They were confused and looking in different directions, and I began to act. In the blink of an eye, I had dispersed all the monsters that were near me, and they didn't just crumble into little pieces. But I got Jin Ho, who mined the magic crystals. Why have I been hiding this skill all this time? He looked at me and realized that I had gotten even stronger, but at the same time I looked at my characteristics and saw that my sprint skill had been upgraded, as well as my death strike skill. I was able to get my first level dagger skill as well. I realized that I had leveled up a bit and gained new skills that I got from that warden's corpse. The content of his skill confuses me, but it is much more effective than my other skills. The whole problem is the continuous mana consumption. I wasn't going to put points into intelligence, but it looks like I'll have to. I hesitated for a moment. I was looking at my stats, and at that moment another wolfhound appeared, rushing right at me and trying to overpower me. But at that very moment, I applied my passive and active skills, and my skillful dagger wielding, as well as my lethal strike, put a fat end to this battle with this wolfhound. At one point, using my skills, I discovered 3 errors in the text. I was glad, because it looked good. And at the same moment I was able to increase my level, but suddenly I saw a notification window with an attention badge. I realized that a certain level was still required, but I did not understand what it meant. In addition, I noticed that I was offered a task to change my profession. I had to make up my mind whether or not to accept this assignment, for the change of profession was important to me. But at this time, the head of the White Tiger arrived at the gate we had recently entered, and his face immediately changed after he saw that right in front of the gate a bunch of people were just sitting at a picnic and eating their food. It looked like a playground for little kids who were brought food and told to stay there. I didn't understand what was going on and why everyone was waiting outside the gate. But suddenly a high school girl came up to the head of the guild and said, "What are they doing here? Because this is the forbidden zone." But the head of the White Tiger Guild wondered, what kind of child is this? And told her not to meddle in adult matters. Besides, this gate area is not safe. However, she replied that she too is a hunter and should not be treated as a child. She is part of this raid, and though she was embarrassed to say so, that she is special, she did not even enter the dungeon with her partners. If the head's intuition doesn't deceive him, I'm definitely the recruit who showed up for the first time in a long time. But suddenly everyone started jumping up and saying that the raid leader was coming back, and everyone should be ready to move out. Jin-ho and I started to leave the portal, and I asked him what the schedule was for tomorrow, for I had forgotten that I had urgent things to do, and it was better not to plan anything for tomorrow. He said that he had already made reservations at the dungeon, but if it was urgent, he would cancel the reservation, and I would really have to cancel the reservation. After all, if we book the gate and don't go in within 2 days, the reservation is automatically cancelled. I thought about it and told him to put it off for a while. But suddenly I heard someone call my name, and when I looked up, I saw a man in front of me. He handed me his business card and said it was a pleasure to meet me. He is the head of the White Tiger Guild's second department. I was surprised because I had heard of the White Tiger Guild before. I wondered what he wanted from me. A while later we found ourselves at a nearby coffee shop and sat at a table talking. That guy started telling me about hunters, reapers, knights, and the words white tigers. I should have heard of them at least once, but instead I replied that of course I knew that the White Tiger Guild was one of the best guilds in South Korea. Then he cut to the chase and said that they wanted to invite me to join the White Tiger Guild and offer me twice the salary of Eugene Company. This White Tiger Guild guy decided that there was no point in stalling, because the true moment had arrived, and if I demonstrated my skills beyond expectations, the remuneration could be increased. I don't see how that can't be a generous offer for a hunter who was still an E-Ranger not too long ago. I decided to ask him how much it cost to build a building so he could offer me that. But this guy didn't know what that meant or why I was asking. Maybe I needed to clarify how much he was willing to increase his generosity. He began to say that they were using it to the tune of 50 billion. After that I asked him if he would really give it to me, but he didn't quite know what I was talking about. 30 billion! Shouted the head of the White Tiger Guild, and it made all the coffee houses go up in ears. He himself was quite frightened, so much so that he even jumped up from his chair. When he saw that everyone was looking at him, he quickly sat back down and pretended that he had accidentally shouted. I began to say that the amount Eugene offered for the straw was 30 billion won. If you offer twice that amount, that means you are offering your 50 billion won. At this point, the head wondered how great his abilities were if Eugene offered him 30 billion won. They had not yet checked his rank and did not know if he was bluffing, since there was no way to check his words. But I replied to him that if he thought I was bluffing, I could provide proof. And since he offered twice as much, I thought he had heard about my deal with Jinho. But that didn't seem to be the case, and the head of the White Tiger Guild began to say that it was not within his power to pay such a sum. If I could give him some time, he would discuss it with the guild leadership. After he said that, I said let's call it a day and started to get up from my chair. After that, the guy started getting nervous and wondering if he might be in too much of a hurry. If only he had known the details of Eugene's proposal, he would have gotten permission from the guild and acted in small but confident steps. But before I left I decided to ask him how he had obtained information about me and whether he had been watching my surroundings. And at that very moment the guild leader felt a cut on his face, which caused him to start bleeding. He realized that I was using invisibility, but I ordered him not to turn around. And after these words it became clear in my head that if I'm an overawakened person who can use invisibility, then the way out of this situation is obvious. And I began to say that he was digging for me on purpose, and he had been informed that someone was sweeping the dungeon too quickly, and they began to investigate the matter. They pushed on me, because 3 major incidents had happened in the dungeons, and he had no evidence. Inside the time, it's no longer a coincidence. And after I was reawakened, I got the abilities of a high-ranking hunter, which helped me get through all these incidents. Jinho must have seen my ability during the second raid, and when I got my father. And that's what I seem to be doing now. And all things considered, it all adds up, and they know what they know. After that I asked him how many people knew about it. And the head of the White Tiger Guild answered that it was just him and one of his subordinates, but at the time that subordinate was sitting outside wondering how the chief was doing. And that's when I realized that maybe mopping up the gate too quickly was drawing too much attention. I don't want the number of people who know about me to increase, and if rumors about me start to spread, you and your subordinates will be ready to answer for it. However, the head of the guild was obligated to report to his superiors, but he didn't want to die either. And then I told him that I would personally warn my subordinate. And at that moment I cancelled my spell and appeared right in front of him, beginning to talk about how we seem to have inconvenienced the White Tiger Guild by removing too many dungeons. Unfortunately, we're not going to stop yet. The head of the guild interrupted me and began explaining that this is exactly the problem. We are letting our newcomers out of the gate by training them, but we can't send them to higher ranked gates. Then I asked, how about a deal? We will sell 3 of our armor, and of course, this offer is only valid for today. If you don't take advantage of this opportunity, it will be difficult to book these gates later. The head asked me, am I really a gate buyer? Gates don't just appear in metropolitan cities, and they can train recruits in other provinces as well? The only problem is that it could cause conflicts between us and the other guilds. Eventually, the head replied that he agreed, and asked how much it would cost. I told him let's say 300 million for each dungeon. But after that, the guild leader got nervous and told me that for mana crystals and magic crystals from the dungeons they could get a maximum of 200 million, and buying at that price would take a big loss. He offered me 200 million won, and after that I said that I agree. And when we shook hands, I told him that 3 brothers for a total of 600 million, that he should transfer the money to my personal account. And finally, I told him that I had a gift for him. He had to open his mouth. And as soon as he opened it, I poured him a special liquid, which made his face disappear early, his head in the same turn. I did not understand what this ability was. Also, the wound on his face instantly healed. I got tired and started walking, and at the end I heard the head ask me about the fact that I had just shown him invisibility and healing abilities. He asked if that could be considered a sign of my trust, but I told him that if it meant that he would at least keep my secret, then yes. At the same moment I disappeared, but a subordinate of the head ran up and started asking him what kind of light it was and how it went with this guy. However, the head of the guild was in the sky and very nervous, because he realized that they had met a much scarier man than they thought. A little later I contacted Jinho, and he told me that the transfer was received 600 million, just as I had told him. Jinho was delighted because the cancelled raids had been sold for that amount. He asked his husband, was I able to sell them? But I answered him with a smile on my face that it was a trade secret. That same day, but a little later, his subordinate came running to the head and began to tell him that there were high-ranking gates left in their area. The head was completely shocked by this news. Oh, and all the prices were under 10 million. And then the head realized that maybe Jinho's team wasn't going to the raid today. And then the chapter got nervous, because not only did he not get any information about Sun Jinwoo, but he was also cheated. Could this mean that he did so out of fear that his identity might be revealed? But suddenly the chapter saw a message from an unknown number. The message said that it was Sun Jinwoo, and with that I could turn a blind eye to the fact that he was digging into his past. At the same moment, after reading that message, the head realized that the deal was a front to get money, and he didn't think I would contact him. After all, I had sent a message to my business card number, but that wasn't bad either. After all, they got Sun Jinwoo's number, and from now on the White Tiger Guild will have the main goal of getting this guy. After all, the money they spent today is not that much money for the White Tiger Guild, although he might still have problems with the higher-ups. That same evening I decided to proceed with my main goal for the near future. A gate appeared before me, which I myself had opened. After all, I decided right today to change my profession. Before it sounded interesting, I can't wait to find out what monsters will be inside, and finally this game started for real. And when I went inside the gate, there were knights waiting for me, who began to fight me as soon as I walked in. They were very strong, but slow at the same time. Because of this, I was able to dodge their attacks. It became difficult for me to fight him. I activated my special skill, Deathstroke. Now I am able to inflict critical damage to the enemy's vital points. At the same time, I also used the sprint skill, which increased my movement speed by 30%. For every minute I use this skill, 1 unit of mana is consumed. However, after all that, I realized that my attacks weren't doing him any damage at all. Although the opponent wasn't too strong, my dagger can't penetrate his armor, and his movements are predictable. His attacks are not strong enough, and his only advantage is defense. He does not use his skills, and perhaps he does not know how to attack effectively. The more he opens up with his movements, the harder I can strike. I already had experience battling similar opponents, but they were proving too tough for my dagger. I grabbed my opponent with my hands like a knight. Eventually I was able to tear off his iron head, and finally kill the knight. This type of monster was weak in long battles, and could you even call them monsters? Most likely a toy monster, and it would be a shame to have to fight only such guys in the future. Also, since I'm using a torch instead of a sacred stone, it's a little dark, just like the instant dungeon. I can't get out until I close it, and it wouldn't hurt to conserve mana. The most frustrating thing is that my health is not restored, and I can't leave this dungeon until I close it. Also, there is a ground restriction in this area, and my health will not regenerate the store as I increase. Although my invisibility and death strike were quite effective, they don't consume too much mana. If I had known this was going to be the case, I would have put some points into intelligence. A certain difficulty in the dungeon, the lack of ability to heal, and the inability to escape make this dungeon too risky. It's a career-changing assignment, it can't be graded. I don't know how many hours or even weeks it will take me to complete this quest, but the worst part is that I can't heal, and I remembered that I had already completed the daily quest today. I thought it would be quick and I could finish it all in one night. If it takes more than 12 hours, I could fall prey to centipedes like that time. I don't feel good. I'd better get a profession and do the daily assignment sooner. Besides, last time I ran away from them as hard as I could, but if I run into a centipede now, can I beat it? But first I'll have to take care of these big guys who rely only on their protection. When a mob of knights came after me, I threw my torch to the ground and started running straight at them, attacking them with my bare hands. After all, my dagger couldn't penetrate their defenses. I struck one of the knights. The result was a dent in his chest, and he flew off toward the other knights who were standing in the middle. However, I still had to deal with the two knights on my sides. I jumped up and started hitting them in the head. I was lucky that the knights were too slow and couldn't keep up with my movements. I could have just jumped and attacked them in midair, since their line of sight was limited because of that armor. Eventually I finally managed to defeat the last knight that stood in my way. I realized that if I couldn't cut them, I could just be where their bones should be. But even decent things fell off some of the knights. It's a money pouch and a breastplate above the knight. It was just wonderful that the elements of the armor could be hidden and not necessarily display their appearance. If anyone saw me, I would be a laughingstock. And I wondered if in reality he would protect me, too. I was also able to get gold from the pouch that fell out, and at this point I had as much as 863,400 gold coins. But suddenly I began to feel something strange, as if someone was approaching me. My instincts did not fail me. I drew my blade and thrust it into the air. However, it turned out that there was a knight using invisibility. I was horrified that there were monsters capable of becoming invisible. Also, there was some huge fireball flying at me, which I was able to turn away from. When I turned around, I saw a mage standing not far from me. He used fire magic and threw that orb of invisibility at me, the same kind of magic that Mr. Huang had used back then in the dungeon. But now I was concerned about the fact of what was going on here. After all, it looks like a repeat of battles that have already been fought. It turned out to be harder than I thought it would be. All the monsters are different types, so I have to use different characteristics to defeat each one. Knights require strength, archers require stamina, and mages require intelligence. If I didn't put enough points into strength, I wouldn't be able to break the armor of knights, and if my perception was lower, I would have problems with assassins. Since I didn't put points into intelligence, I'd have to save mana as much as possible and stop using skills altogether. Also, I'm starting to get tired. I have to finish as quickly as possible. The longer this goes on, the worse it is for me. I'll have to close my eyes for a while and get some rest to reduce the fatigue. But suddenly an arrow flew at me, which I caught right in front of my face. And when I looked up, I saw the archers standing not far from me. Luckily, it looked like they weren't going to give me a break. I was able to overpower them, and a little later I found another bag with 20,000 gold in it. There was also a bottle filled with warm water. I upgraded a bit and collected quite a few items. I also got some rest and thought I could move on to the next stage. However, the way I looked was ridiculous with that guard necklace, the breastplate above the knight, the archers and higher knights' gauntlets, and the assassin's boots. It all looked awful on me, but I was glad no one could see it. I was pretty much leveled up. And when I saw the big door in front of me, I wondered what skills the monster lurking behind that door had. After all, this was the boss's room, and that bone-chilling cold was coming right out from behind the door. When I opened the door, I saw that all the torches that were in this room were lit. I could hardly see anything in front of me, for there was some kind of strange fog, but eventually I could see that it was the royal throne room. I began to hear some footsteps, as if someone was approaching me from the darkness, and my vision, hearing, and fingertips began to give me signals. I realized that I remembered the feeling. It was the same as in the double dungeon. This coldness, I realized, seemed to emanate from this guy who was coming toward me. After feeling that way, I doubted whether I could beat him. And what should I even do? After all, my fatigue had more or less calmed down, but it wouldn't be for long if this battle dragged on with him. This huge knight began to emerge from the wall. He looked terrifying in his bloody armor. It was the blood-red warlord Igris. I saw a dark red name that was definitely different from the others. It was a knight defending the empty throne of Igris. It did not take him long to attack me. He swung his great sword, but I managed to duck in time, and he missed. Soon after that, total destruction began, as he cleaved through the pillars like air. To me, this guy turned out to be an insanely strong knight. He was also impenetrable, as my blade didn't even leave a scratch on his armor. I didn't expect her to attack me instantly in response to what I was trying to do to her. She swung her big sword and struck with all her might, making the ground beneath us shake. But I managed to jump away, and now I was flying through the air. Suddenly I saw something red moving right toward me, and smoke began to rise from underneath it. It was already too close, right next to my face, and luck was on my side. I was able to dodge after all, and his blow hit the nearest column that was behind me, and it started to collapse. And as soon as the column collapsed, I was able to jump off the back of it and look right at his back. It was hard for me to breathe because the fight didn't stop for a second. Also, my armor speed reduction effect only works if my strength is below 80. This guy's strength is definitely above 70. His destructive power far exceeds mine, and his agility also prevents my dagger from penetrating his armor. That means his defense is higher than mine. If there is any way to defeat him, I realize that he is even stronger than I could have imagined. I don't think I can beat him without a weapon. If I don't try to penetrate his armor, I can't do any damage to him. There is only one way, and it could be much worse: a bare-knuckle fight. But Igris noticed it, too, that I hid my blade, and began to look at me strangely. He seemed to understand. I want to fight with my bare hands, and in the meantime he was aiming his big sword straight into the ground and began to drop his cloak to the side. He was also willing to fight me with his bare hands, though he was a terrible knight, but he was fair. He decided to show me nobility by fighting me as an equal, too. He underestimates me, but at the same moment he started running straight at me with the purpose of destroying me. He turned out to be pretty fast, and in an instant he was already near me and hit me right in the chest. I hesitated from the blow, and at that moment he grabbed me by my clothes and threw me into the nearest wall, which I broke through. I was stunned by the sheer force he displayed in a split second, but that was only the beginning, and at the same moment he ran up to me and hit me again with all his strength. I was able to block that blow somehow, but eventually our environment collapsed completely, and debris began to fly around me. The air in the room was polluted with dust from that blow. Because I was able to somehow block his blow with my hands, I was able to bounce to the side. I blocked that punch, but I felt like I lost about half my life. If it wasn't for the armor that time, I wouldn't have survived if I had continued to take direct hits. He remained surprisingly strong even without his sword, and I began to question whether I could even stand up to this monster with dignity. Even if I lose in strength, I have to rely on speed, and I began to activate my sprint skill. The speed of my movement increased by 30%. I became too fast and approached him. At the same moment he elbowed me right in the head. I managed to put my arm up in time to block his blow. His arm bounced to the side, and at that same moment we fought furiously. Our blows were so fast that it was impossible for an observer to see even one straight punch. Because I was too tired and exhausted after the battle with the knights, I underestimated my capabilities. He hit me with such force that I started spinning in the air, and at the same time my health dropped below 30%. At the same moment my fortitude skill was activated, and the damage I received was reduced by 50%. If my defense increased in conjunction with my passive skill, I still had a chance. I couldn't give up in flight, and I was able to strike him in the head. But soon after, I saw his gaze pointing directly at me, and he got even angrier. He grabbed my leg with his hand and hit me with such force that I instantly flew aside. I hadn't expected that at all. After all, I thought I could somehow get through some more time and come up with a plan, But as soon as I started flying into the nearest wall and made a big hole in it, I started to come to my senses and realized that I was sitting on that throne in this room. And from that impact, I was thrown right across the room. I was sitting there opening the pancake and I started bleeding. At the same moment, Igris realized that it was over, and as he approached me, he raised his big hand to give me one last blow, after which I would no longer be able to stand on my own feet. Somehow he began to summon his sword, which was nearby, shredding the ground. The sword instantly flew straight into his hand, which he raised, and he swung it, pointing it straight at my neck to deliver one last blow. If I had hesitated for a second, he would have ended our fight. But I managed to block his blow with my hand. After all, I still had one more item, the Gauntlet of the High Knight, which gave me 3% physical damage absorption and had the added effect of preventing rock injury if my strength was less than 80. As a result, my movement speed was reduced. There was a big wave around us that raised all the dust in the air, and I started with my other hand. After all, I hadn't lost yet. And as soon as my blade was in my hand, I stabbed it right in the head. Igris rolled to the side after my blow, and at that moment I picked him up and started running straight with him to the other side. For in that moment I realized that I could overpower him. I ran across the room with my blade, and suddenly crashed into the nearest wall. At the same time, Iris raised his hand to pull my blade from his helmet. I told him that I wouldn't let anyone touch my things, and even if my dagger was stolen, I could summon it back. At last I could deliver one last crushing blow. I thrust my blade in one more time, and though it didn't feel like enough, I realized that I needed a little more and it would be over. My Deathstroke skill was activated several times, and eventually, I hit him with all my might and looked him straight in the eye, for I wanted to finally wait for the moment when he let out his last breath before I beat him completely. And that moment finally arrived. Igris fell after my blows. And, finally, I saw the notification I had dreamed of. I finally killed the bloody red warlord Igris. And at that very moment my level went up. I was terribly exhausted, and I sat right beside him, watching to see if it was over for sure. I had finally won. It was really close, and I felt the impact of technique, skill, and experience. I was weaker in every aspect. It's pure luck that I was able to win. After all, any mistake could have cost me my life if my opponent is so strong that he can fight on a par with the hunters and have the same rank. But suddenly I saw that I had knocked out the snow, the ruler's touch, the leather pouch, and the stone. Coming back was a joyous moment, for I had won as many as 4 awards at a time, and to me it was a well-deserved prize. Looking at it, you could tell that the risk was worth it. And when I opened the leather pouch, I found 1.5 million gold inside. I couldn't tell you how happy I was to have gotten it all in one go. I had never had that much gold before. To think, my gold had doubled in an instant. Also, I was able to get an item of rank S, unless you count the key to the gate of the demonic castle. This was the first time I had an S-rank piece of equipment in my hands, and the characteristics were also significantly different. Even a simple 15% increase in physical damage absorption would be a great boost, but adding 20 to my stamina and strength stats is incredible. And then there's the rune, and I was wondering what skill it contains. However, the skill can be gained by destroying the rune. There's also the return stone, which is a unique item to complete a quest. If you destroy the return stone, you can leave the dungeon instantly. If the skill change quest is completed in the dungeon, it will automatically be destroyed with no way to return. But I didn't understand why I was given the return stone, because it was definitely a room that opened in an instant. If the return stone had fallen out, it might have meant that the quest was not yet complete, and I would have many more battles to fight in order to change my profession. It didn't take long before I began to feel something appear near me. As soon as I turned my head to the right, I saw a portal appear beside me. I turned around and saw many portals appear near me. At that moment, I realized that the career change mission had begun. I already knew it couldn't be otherwise. The longer I last, the more points I can gain. The number of points determines how highly ranked a profession I get. And just as the time meter started going, I saw someone slowly start to exit the portals. I saw a bunch of knights coming out of the portals one by one. I realized that I could handle these guys even in my current state. If they were at Igris level, I wouldn't even be able to handle the first opponents. So the longer you last, the more points you gain. The probability of getting a hidden class increases with every second, and it's good enough to do the job of changing professions. I have 390 mana left, and using it requires 200 mana. I also have 190 mana units left to maintain invisibility. It also requires 1 life unit per second to maintain invisibility. This means that I can last in invisibility for 3 minutes, and I have enough health, HP. I will try to last as long as possible. A mage appeared out of nowhere and started using the detection skill, and at the same moment he was able to find me, even when I was in my invisibility skill. That's when I knew I was in trouble. All the knights that were near me started to notice me and attack, but I bounced to the side and hit them from behind, which made them start flying in different directions. Corrected text: as soon as they flew off to the side, I stood up to my full height, turned around, at which point my blood activated, reducing the target stats by 50% for 1 minute. My bloodlust consumes 100 mana. It's my only chance, I have to give it my all for the duration of the skill. But there were too many enemies, and they were coming right at me. There were so many that they couldn't get through the corridor properly, and they were all pushing against each other. At the end of the corridor, a terrible battle broke out. And eventually, I started taking damage and my HP started decreasing. Because they were coming from the gate faster than I had time to deal with them, and my passive skill Fortitude was activated, but it wasn't enough. After all, I'd taken it too lightly and wasted too much mana on invisibility. And at this rate I wouldn't be able to use the skills anytime soon. I wondered if it was time for me to use the returning stone. And I'm not sure I'd get anything out of switching professions at my current level, it's too complicated. If I used the return stone, it would mean that I had failed the task. But as soon as I looked at the time, I saw that only 5 minutes had passed, and it looked like there was nothing left but for me to get out of this dungeon.